Welcome, everyone, this is your friend, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of, what if Spider-Man became the heart of the Avengers? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic, The Plane Ride Over. Dear God, what have I gotten myself into? It had been wider than he'd expected on the inside, and a bit of an overload to the senses. Leather, oil, metal, cologne, and stale alcohol were just a handful of the powerful smells that flooded over him upon entry, and seemed more poignant than ever now. The hum of the engine sounded dull to the one other occupant of the aircraft, but to him was a deafening roar that reverberated through his whole body and made the floor quake beneath his feet. He sat at the end of a row of empty seats, trying to soak it all in, jittery and wide-eyed. I'm on the quinjet. The Avengers freaking quinjet. This is insane. Crazy. What was I even thinking about before all this happened? Grocery shopping, web shooter upgrades, that Italian culture project that I still haven't started? Oh crap. Will this count as an unexcused absence? I hope I'll be home before school tomorrow, so that's not an issue. He can work something out for me if I'm not, right? I mean, he's an Avenger, and who the hell wouldn't listen to? How's it feel, kid? Fit well enough. Peter Parker was startled from his thoughts by the voice, and glanced up quickly. Huh? Oh, why yeah, I think so. Good. Great. Like a spidery glove. He pulled at the red material above his wrist and snapped it against the back of his hand, astonished by how dramatic an upgrade the suit was from the piece of crap he'd thrown together from garbage scraps and dared called a superhero costume. From the delicate web details, to the dual spider insignias, to the popping red and blue color scheme, it was amazing, unreal. His dry throat couldn't even find the words. I can't believe you actually made this for me. Tony Stark, aka the famous Iron Man, simply shrugged without turning to face him, resting a hand casually on top of the wheel. Don't sweat it. Trust me. It was made with primarily selfish intentions. If I had to meet up with the rest of the crew with you in your baggy long johns, I think I would die of second-hand embarrassment. Peter chuckled nervously, slipping the Spider-Man mask off his head and draping it over the armrest with care. The glossy eye lenses stared up at him in a menacingly charming way, and he rubbed at the back of his neck. Hey, I probably would too, Mr. Stark. You guys, you're all just so cool, with your outfits and tech and perfectly styled hair. He rubbed his hands together in his lap, trying not to sound as starstruck as he felt but failing remarkably. Do I actually get to meet them? We're all joining up in skiudits. Rhodey's there, tracking Cap's movements. Nat and T'Challa are just ahead of us, and Vision's just behind. Our window's very small, so there won't be time for chit-chat. We've gotta jump right in and finish this before Ross decides to get involved, and things get bloody. He recalled in that moment why he had been summoned by the great Tony Stark in the first place. This wasn't some happy-go-lucky field trip for small talking with the most awesome people in the world. There was serious stuff going on here, serious enough to split the Avengers team right down the middle. He gathered some bits and pieces from the news, but overall was pretty uninformed on the whole situation, and could hardly bring himself to believe it. Captain America and Iron Man. Fighting? The pair were, like, his biggest idols ever, hero-wise, at least, science-wise. Banner had to take the cake. He knew their disagreement had something to do with their fallout in Sokovia and that weird, evil robot. But Peter couldn't imagine what kind of controversy could polarize two of the greatest heroes on the planet so brazenly. After an uncertain pause, Peter opened his mouth to ask a question, closed it, then opened it again, when a tremor suddenly passed through the ship. Then, out of nowhere, the entire aircraft jerked to the left, and Peter nearly flew out of his seat with a yelp of surprise. Stark quickly seized the wheel with both hands and yanked it upright, steering the plane back to a level position. Whoa, haha. Sorry about that, he said. Just a little turbulence. You haven't really had the true quinjet experience yet until she's thrown you into the walls and ceiling a few times. Spider-Man gingerly crawled back into his chair, shaken. Just when he thought everything was okay again, another violent quake shook the aircraft, and he shrunk against the seat. Now that I think about it, you and Aunt Hottie probably don't travel much, huh? Hell, kid, have you even ridden in a regular airplane before? Is this your first time flying ever? Well, It's probably not too shocking, seeing that you flip above skyscrapers on the regular, right? When no response came, Tony frowned, then finally turned around. He was surprised to find the kid practically buried into his seat, fingers gripped like iron to the armrests, face pale. He was glancing around the cabin with evident fear in his eyes and wincing at every bump and bounce of the plane. "Hey, what's the matter?" he asked. Peter turned to him sharply, a tinge of embarrassment rushing to his cheeks, his words shaking as they left his lips. Nothing, Mr. Stark, it's nothing. It's just. Is this thing? Is it? Why safe?" Tony snorted in amusement. "Yes, Spider-ling, it's safe. Certainly safer than taking the subway. I designed this beauty myself, so give me a little credit and quit cowering like a baby kitten back there." But Peter did not quit cowering like a baby kitten. His reassurance did not seem to ease the kid's anxiety at all. The quinjet hit another rough patch of air at that moment, and Stark watched Peter flinch harshly and squeeze his eyes shut. His whole body grew rigid and defensive. Immediately, Tony realized that something was wrong. This was not the normal nervousness or unease that the young recruit was bound to experience amidst all of this chaos and excitement. He recognized the kid's fear as something seated and irrational, something that he'd seen in himself for a long time. Smile fading, Stark switched the plane to autopilot and rose from his seat. He carefully made his way to the belly of the ship and spun a chair around, plopping right next to Spider-Man. When Peter realized the Avenger had seated himself beside him, he straightened his spine with a start. "All right, Spill. What's eating you, kid? You look like Thor watching Neighbors for the first time. And if you say you're scared of heights, I'm going to throw you all the way back to Queens." Peter swallowed painfully and forced a very unconvincing smile onto his face. What? No, I'm fine, Mr. Stark. Great, in fact. Peachy. Rad. Whatever the kids are saying these days. I mean, who's living better than me right now? The quinjet leapt under their feet again, and he impulsively cringed against the backrest, gritting his teeth together. "Yeah, well, it looks to me like you're scared out of your spandex. Is it really the plane thing? 'Cause I figured it'd be after we landed when the nerves might set in. I guarantee you've got nothing to worry about while flying with me, alright?" "I know," he agreed sheepishly. His knuckles were white and shivery as he gripped onto the arm rests, and a line of sweat was beaded along his brow. I know. It's stupid, okay? It didn't hit me until the turbulence thing." He averted his eyes to the floor, trying not to look out the wide window ahead, mortified by how childish and panicky he was acting in front of his idol. "It just made me think about my folks, that's all. But I'm fine now, Mr. Stark. Fit as a fiddle, whatever the hell that means. Honest." The boy's words nicked at Tony's heart. He knew that the kid had lost his parents when he was little, and only recently faced the unexpected death of his uncle. From what Stark had read up on him, Peter Parker had been through a lot, despite only being 15 years old. And that was without mentioning the whole gaining superpowers ordeal that had led to him donning a spidery alter ego and lumping even more problem-loaded teenage shoulders. Sudden guilt rose into his throat at that moment as he thought about how he was now dragging him into this entirely new mess of superhero drama to deal with, but he quickly swallowed it down. They needed the numbers, and the ability to capture and contain their misguided friends quickly and without anyone getting hurt if they resisted. Spider-Man was essential to their mission for that in itself, and more. "Your folks?" he repeated back, crossing his arms against his chest. Then it hit him. Oh, it was a plane crash, wasn't it? After a pause, Peter nodded reluctantly without meeting his gaze, and it's not like I really knew them or anything. I can barely remember them, if at all. So it's just this weird. It just came over me. Yeah, I've never flown before. And I know it's stupid for me to actually be worried that could happen, but I don't know." A sad smile pulled at Tony's lips. "It's all right. It makes sense for it to freak you out a bit. Everyone's got something, I used to have anxiety attacks over my fear of aliens and wormholes. Imagine trying to explain that to a therapist." Peter glanced up at Tony, his expression brightening hesitantly. A small giggle escaped him. "Really? That's funny. I mean, no offense, Mr. Stark. Because the alien attack in New York that you guys stopped? Yep. Messed me up something awful. Everyone's got some tick they don't want anyone else knowing about, and everyone eventually finds a way to deal with it. My anxiety thing resurfaces every now and then, but I've got a better cap on it. It just takes time. He sighed quietly and patted his shoulder. For now, do me a favor and try not to stress, "Kay? You're safe." Spider-Man's body had relaxed a little, and he had pried his fingers from the armrests and placed them calmly in his lap. He exhaled levelly, then nodded. "Okay. Yeah. Thanks. I'm good now." "Good," Tony replied, slipping his phone from his pocket and tapping on the screen. "'Cause speaking of caps, it's time to talk about the trouble we're facing with one in particular." A picture of the infamous star-spangled super soldier suddenly flickered to life on the small device, then expanded into a large, holographic image. Immediately, Peter's uneasiness concerning the plane shrunk away, and his focus rerouted to the much bigger and more threatening issue that glowed before him in brilliant 3D. Steve Rogers, aka Captain America, is on the run right now from the government and the police. He and a few of his friends, including a flying Birdman and his psychotic war buddy, have created a wake of destruction and casualties in their attempts to escape capture. Cap's being irrational, incooperative, and a general pain in my ass. Evidently, he has to be stopped. Photos of the two other men appeared alongside Captain America, along with headlines highlighting the damages their actions had resulted in over the last few days. Our team's got less than 15 hours to bring them all in before General Ross sends out some special ops force to take them down, and he's willing to use lethal force to do so. That's why we have to stop Cap and his crew ourselves. Quickly, and in as civil a manner as we can manage. Does all that make sense? Mr. Stark, Peter chimed in, his head swimming with the flood of information, yet one question standing out prominently in his mind, about Captain America. He's not a bad guy, right? I mean, I've looked up to him for so many years. He's helped you save the world over and over again. He shook his head perplexedly. What happened? Tony sighed. The world's become a darker and stranger place, kid. It's so much harder to tell the difference between right and wrong anymore, even for a man like Cap. No, he's not a bad guy. But he's let his loyalty to one seriously messed up fellow cloud his judgment and drive him to do some very bad stuff. And we can't allow it to continue. He genuinely believes that what he's doing right now is right, even though it's so clearly wrong, and that makes him dangerous. Hell, I wouldn't even put it past him to try to convince you that he's right if he ever gets the chance. Don't let him get to you. He's got to be brought in, for everyone's safety. Peter mulled this over for a little while, considering the many lapses in judgment he'd had over his short superhero career, and warily swallowed it down. Okay. I guess that makes sense. So, what do you want me to do? Tony Stark clicked his phone off, slipped it into his jacket, then interlaced his fingers against his knee, a smirk playing along his lips. You, Captain Underpants, are here to help us out in case things go the way I'm predicting they will once we intercept Steve's entourage in Germany. Meaning south, as in he doesn't come with us peacefully and quietly like we'd all appreciate. I'm 90% sure he and his friends are going to put up a fight, which means we're going to have to put up a fight back. But I don't want things to have to get all explosive and bloody, and that's where you come in. Me? Yeah, you? That webbing of yours is great for pinning people down, slowing them up, annoying the hell out of them. It's exactly what we need to stop Cap's crew without having to beat them unconscious. So while we're all wailing on each other, I want you to flip around the scene and web up all hostile ass. Don't engage directly with any of them. The big boys will take care of that. I don't want you getting hurt and your aunt having a cow or something. Just do your thing from a distance, and we'll have this whole predicament bagged in a jiffy. I can hold my own in a fight, Mr. Stark, he said quickly. I've been in plenty already. I have powers. I can help you guys on the ground or in the air or wherever you might need me. Especially since I have this weird thing in my head that tells me when something bad is about to happen, which I like to call. You're not fighting, Peter, Tony interrupted, shutting him down without a second thought. This is something entirely different than beating on purse snatchers in parking garages. These guys are expert killers that eat little greenhorns like you for breakfast. And it's not Cap I'm worried about, it's the other two, one of which is an overpowered murdering machine who would shoot you in the head, stab you in the face, or snap your scrawny neck in half without blinking. Or all of the above at the same time. There's also a chance that Barton, bow and arrow brandishing assassin, and Wanda Maximoff, witch lady, might be there as well, both of whom are more than capable of breaking you like a toothpick. I'm not taking any chances, kid. Peter blinked, wide-eyed. Hawkeye is going to be there too. Oh man, this is the best day of my life. When Tony shot him an unamused glare, however, he quickly sobered up. Sorry. I mean, okay, I'll try not to get killed. But what if one of them comes after me or something? Then I'll have to fight. You're much faster, nimbler, and smaller than most of the guys on their side. Add that to the fact that you can climb walls and zip around like an acrobatic ninja on steroids. I think you should be able to avoid direct confrontation. But here's my rundown, in case you do. If it's Clint, web up his quiver so he can't get to his arrows. Wanda. Don't let her catch you with her magic. Nail her in the hands or eyes or something. Wilson, Birdman. Web up his wings. Cap. Get that shield out of his hands. If you can't, go for his legs. No matter what he's doing, even when he goes full turtle mode and hides his entire body behind his shield, his legs are always exposed. Exploit it. As for Barnes, just don't. Yeah. Run for your life. I'm kidding, but also kinda not. Just stay alert and be smart, kid. You'll manage. Inhaling resolutely, Tony held out his palm. Let me see your hand. Puzzled, Peter slowly stretched his arm forwards. Stark took hold of it and turned it over so his palm was upright and tapped on the small device secured to his wrist. Have you tried them out yet? Ifications to your web shooters and made you a brand new, tricked out pair, with a little extra Stark-style flair sprinkled in. Fully loaded with your nasty web fluid and everything. Peter's eyes lit up. Whoa, really? And no, I haven't. He glanced down at his wrist, stared around the cabin, then hunched his shoulders shyly. Can I? Stark gestured with a careless wave of his hand. Fire away, kiddo. Same principle. Press down on the triggers on your palms with your fingers, and out comes the funk. Just don't hit anything important. He nodded eagerly, then stood from his chair. Eyeing a bottle on top of the plane's dashboard, Peter focused his enhanced senses, aimed his arm in front of his body, then carefully folded his fingertips to his palm. Instantly, a line of webbing shot from the device with incredible speed and latched onto the far-off object, causing it to shake and stagger from the impact. Peter laughed with delight, turning back to Tony excitedly. Wow, haha, awesome, it's all been improved. The balance, the precision, the velocity, everything, it's all so much better than my old ones. How'd you fix them? Tony shrugged passively. Just a little fine-tuning and some higher quality tech and materials. All the design aspects are the same as your originals. If you had the resources I did, you could have built the same things, probably even better ones. With a jerk of his wrist, Peter whipped the bottle across the plane and snatched it out of the air. All that, and no loss of tensile strength. Is this my same web fluid? Yep. Barely had to touch that stuff. You must be quite the little science whiz to have come up with that concoction yourself. He poked at the lines of black fabric stretched along Spider-Man's waist, causing him to jump a little. See these tiny capsules here? They're full of extra web fluid in case you run out. Just open the top of your shooter, pull out the empty capsule, snag a full one off your side, and pop that sucker right in. It takes 2 seconds. Peter ran his fingers against the little containers, picturing the steps he'd take in his head if it came to that. Huh. I've never carried extra web cartridges with me. You'd think I would have thought to do something like this after the 3rd or 4th time I nearly plummeted to my death. He laughed lightheartedly. I wish I'd known you when I first got my powers. You're always thinking one step ahead of everything, Mr. Stark. Tony looked at him with a mixture of pity and admiration. Yeah. I try, kid. But you know, it never seems to make a difference during the moments it really matters. Peter's smile faltered slightly, and he watched as the middle-aged icon lifted from his chair with a stretch, rubbed at his tired, sunken eyes, and stumbled down the belly of the plane all the way back to his seat. He slumped into the chair with defeated-looking movements, scrunching up his brow and massaging his temples with his forefingers. There was an exhaustion to the man when standing in his presence that Peter had never recognized in all of the billionaire's TV interviews and press conferences. He always looked so cool and composed and confident, until now. It was a bit disheartening. He couldn't imagine what this must be like. Having to hunt down your friend and deliver them to the police. And haunted with the knowledge that if you didn't succeed, they might be killed. Knowing that they would likely never forgive or understand your actions. He wondered, wherever he was in Germany at that moment, if Captain America was sitting alone as well, struggling with the same painful truth for his friendship with Tony Stark. Before he could conjure anything to say to try to cheer up the weary Avenger, Tony released his face, then motioned with his head towards the skyline. Schkeuditz is coming up just ahead. We'll be there in about 6 minutes, and then things are going to get real. You sure you're ready for this, kid? Peter's heart fluttered in his chest as his eyes revisited the wide windows gaping down to the dark landmiles below. That was a good question, he realized. Was he, Peter Parker, 15-year-old nerd from Queens who lived in a dingy apartment with his aunt? He had never been involved in anything on this scale as Peter Parker or Spider-Man. The fallout of what happened over the next few hours could change the world, and be a matter of life and death for who knows how many people. Not to mention that Spider-Man would no longer be some no-name vigilante from New York. This really meant something. By joining this war, he was taking a stand as a new kind of hero. However it ended, there was no turning back from that. The teenager swallowed the lump lodged in his throat, then locked his gaze on the approaching cityscape. Why yeah. I think I am. Great, Tony exclaimed, clicking a button that caused the landing gear to unfold beneath the aircraft, because I've already come up with a plan for when Cap inevitably resists us that involves you. Peter blinked. Really? When I give the signal, you're going to jump out, do some crazy flip thing through the air like you always do, snag Cap's shield right from his hands, then stick a perfect superhero landing. If you do it right, it will make you seem way more intimidating and badass than you actually are, and maybe everyone will take you a little more seriously than, well, you know, a fetus in colorful pantyhose. Nervous excitement rushed over the teenage superhero. He threw on his Spider-Man mask and ran to Tony's side. Seriously? You'd let me do that? Oh, I am so down. What should I say? When I stick the landing, I mean? Or maybe when I'm in the air? What would you say? Do you think, even though we're all kind of fighting and stuff, it would make Cap think I'm cool? I'm sorry, but I'm still such a big fan of his. He's awesome. I mean, why you're awesome too, Mr. Stark, but, you know, Captain America. And oh, hey, what's my signal going to be? Tony chuckled softly at the kid's youthful giddiness, and wished for a moment that he could step into the young man's shoes for a day and see the world through his naive, untainted eyes. Heaving a lofty sigh, Stark wrapped his arm around Spider-Man's back and gave him a few solid slaps on the shoulder. Forgetting about the hell that awaited him at the end of this plane ride and allowing himself to simply enjoy the company of the zealous hero, if only for just an instant. Trust me, kid, you'll know, a little guidance. Where'd you find this kid, Stark? He's not yours, is he? Tony choked on his coffee in response, grabbing his chest and barely managing not to drop his mug to the floor. Jesus, Natasha, no, it's nothing like that. He's just a hero with powers that showed up on my radar a few months ago that I thought could be useful in the future. Hence the airport battle. The two sat at the bar in the penthouse of Avengers Tower, sipping lazily at their beverages to overcome the mid-morning lull. Peter Parker, dressed in his full Spider-Man costume, was tinkering with the web shooters Tony Stark had given him on the workbench across the room. His back was to them, branded with the gaudy spider design, which Natasha Romanoff's eyes were locked on. And that was a terrible idea. You brought a child into a war he had no business being involved with. He did a good job. Didn't you see him take down that giant dude? Or were you too busy playing double agent again? He could have been killed, Stark. Tony eyed her confusedly over a long swig of his drink. What's with you? Didn't you start training to be an assassin when you were, like, 2 weeks old? What's got you so spun up over the kid? After a moment, she tore her gaze away from the boy and stared at Tony with a steely expression. Because I know what it's like to be turned into something I never asked to become, and to be used by others for my abilities to do things I never wanted to do. He blinked back at her with a bewildered look on his face, then sipped at his coffee sourly. Alright, I get the gist. But if I hadn't brought him under my wing, someone else with less friendly intentions would have eventually gotten to him. And whether or not he's with us, The kid's going to get himself into trouble. Swinging around the city in those footy pajamas, looking for a fight. If he's going to be in a war, whatever the scale, I at least want him to have us around to give him a little guidance." Natasha snorted. "Guidance, huh?" She chugged down her coffee, wiped her hand across her mouth, then slammed her mug against the counter. "You know what, yeah. I think that's just what our new recruit needs." Startled, Tony watched as she rose from her chair, marched across the room, and gave Peter's head a harsh shove, making him flinch in surprise and glance up at her. "Battle training, Greenhorn. You and me, hand to hand, let's go." With that, she walked around the couch, punched a code into the panel on the wall, and strode into the sparring room without looking back. Peter sat in silence for a second, quite shell-shocked and confused, then turned to Tony. Though he couldn't see his face through his mask, Stark was pretty sure the kid was looking at him with a startled expression. Help," his wide eye lenses conveyed. But Tony only laughed and interlaced his fingers behind his head. "Sorry, Whippy. I've got nothing for ya. Better just scurry right along. And don't worry. If you don't survive her guidance, I'll make sure you're well remembered in a long, eloquent obituary." Peter visibly wilted at his words. He glanced across the room, then down to his hands, then slowly and begrudgingly stood from his seat. Scooping his web shooters off the table, he shuffled over to the doors, exhaled unsteadily, and stepped inside. Spider-Man didn't know Natasha Romanoff very well. They'd hardly interacted with one another during the battle in Germany or since. From an uninformed point of view, she seemed like a relatively kind and unthreatening individual. However, knowing her reputation as an Avenger assassin, and after a quick scan of a couple of superhero blogs and wiki pages dedicated to the infamous Black Widow, it had quickly become clear to Peter that Natasha Romanoff was one of the scariest and most deadly human beings on the planet who could kill a man 100 different ways with nothing but a hairpin. Therefore, he believed he was in his right mind to be scared out of his wits at that moment. She stood facing him in the middle of the unnervingly small room, hands on her hips. He stood in front of the opposite wall, stiff and nervous. "Get rid of those things. No weapons." Peter glanced down at his wrists. "Oh. Okay." He slipped the web shooters off and rolled them out of the room, then rubbed at his bare forearms uneasily. The doors shut behind him as soon as they were clear, and he winced, realizing he was trapped inside with her. "Nowhere to run now, Pete." Tossing her hair over her shoulder, Natasha stared at him with a smug expression, like a wolf eyeing a rabbit as its next meal. "So you're Spider-Man, huh?" The young hero swallowed, then offered a small nod. "I don't think you and I have had the pleasure of formally meeting, Spider-Man. I'm Natasha. You can call me Agent Romanoff, Black Widow, Nat, whatever. And in case it wasn't clear, I'm here to whoop your pale, baby spider ass into shape." Peter kneaded at his shoulder anxiously. "Okay. Sure. Could I ask what compelled you to want to do this all of a sudden? I mean, did I do or say anything to make you, hate me or whatever?" She smirked. "Not particularly. I just figured since we're stuck with you now thanks to Tony, I should take it upon myself to give you a few pointers on how to actually fight so you might be able to avoid getting yourself killed in the near future." "Oh, gotcha. Okay, thanks. Lesson 1. Evasion and self-defense." Wait, what? Out of nowhere, Natasha swung her fist straight at his face. Startled into action by his spidey sense buzzing at the base of his skull, Peter ducked out of the way, but she anticipated his movements. As he bent low, she drove her knee into his chin, then knocked him in the side of the head with a jarring punch to the temple. Spider-Man hit the ground hard, sputtering in shock and grimacing in pain. He regathered himself quickly, however, staring up at the master assassin and gripping his jaw. Ow. You react too predictably. Either you fix yourself, or you die." She pulled her leg back and jabbed it towards the young hero's chest, but he was much more focused now. He jerked out of the way, somersaulting backwards, then popped back up and landed on his feet in a low crouch. Was there a waiver I was supposed to sign before getting roped into this?" he exclaimed skittishly, but Natasha's attack was undeterred, and she was on him in an instant. Her fist flew at his shoulder, and he twisted to the left. Her foot swung at his ribcage, and he blocked it with his forearm. She dropped to the ground and swept a leg at his ankles, but he leapt over it. Changing her approach, she lunged at his neck, aiming to lock him in a chokehold, but Peter shrunk to the floor and sprung between her lungs, rolling to his feet safely behind her. She spun around with a grin, hands balled at her sides, and bolted at him. Legs and fists swung at his body in an alternating frenzy, changing angles and depth every second, and he backpedaled frantically, dulling the blows with sporadic movements and guarding himself with his arms. Despite this, a strong punch managed to nail him in the collarbone, and a black boot kicked the front of his shin. She snaked her arm around the back of his knee and nearly buckled his legs underneath him, but he dropped into a back handspring just in time in order to regain his balance. Growing sick of the abuse, he tracked the pathway of a fist directed to strike him in the chest, threw up his hand at just the right moment, and caught her knuckles in his palm. "Better," she panted, straining against his powerful grip, "but maybe you should try fighting back for a change." "You said this was self-defense training," he huffed breathlessly. "That was lesson 1. If all you know how to do is skirt around your enemy's attacks, you'll never hold up in a real fight." Grunting with effort, Romanov jumped off the floor, driving the fist held in Spider-Man's hand downwards, and delivered a solid kick to his stomach. Peter stumbled back until he hit the wall, clutching onto his aching belly and slipping a little too. She continued cheerfully. "Offense. You come at me this time, and, if you can, hit me with your best shot." Peter lifted his gaze to hers, alarm swelling in his chest. "What? No, I can't do that." "Why not?" "Because well, I could hurt you." "I'm hurting you." "Well, yeah, but that's different." "Not really, no," he pushed off the wall, wincing a little. "But I have enhanced strength. I could punch you and accidentally break a bone or something." "Prove it." He traced his fingers along a welt forming under his skin and swallowed uncertainly. Peter would much rather have the shit beat out of him than be responsible for injuring Black Widow. He was trying to bank off the excuse that he still did not understand the full extent of his super strength as the reason behind his unwillingness, but in reality, it was something else. A semi-awkward, slightly embarrassing something else. When Spider-Man didn't make any move against her, Natasha scoffed impatiently and curled her hands into fists. "Fine then. Guess I'll have to make you prove it." He glanced up at her fearfully. Huh? What does that mean? Do I want to know what that means?" Pressing her thumbs against the small triggers in her gloves, the black devices around both of her wrists hummed to life with a neon blue glow. The color was vivid and menacing, and she charged at him with new determination. Alerted by a stronger tingle inside his head, Spider-Man sprung onto the wall and stuck to it by the skin of his hands and feet. He skittered onto the ceiling before she could reach him and sprawled against the upside-down surface, but immediately realized that it was unusually low to the ground, much lower than any normal ceiling should be. Eyeing the thin space between where the walls and the ceiling met, it dawned on Peter in a stinging rush. "This room is adjustable. She must have lowered the ceiling down just so I couldn't escape getting my ass whooped. Of all the dirty, rotten, but kinda clever." His spidey sense suddenly went haywire inside his head, and he glanced down right as Natasha leapt from the floor. She jammed her wrist against the bottom of his neck, and a horrible jolt of electricity jarred through his whole body. His grip faltered from the blow, and he slowly dropped to the ground, stunned and moaning. A tag from my gauntlets would have knocked out a normal man. You're lucky your body is so resilient. Instead of depending on that resilience in order to cut corners and narrowly escape defeat, you need to train to harness it as a viable combat asset. What the hell? He muttered dazedly, dragging himself to his hands and knees and blinking up at her. "Hey, you said no weapons? That really hurt?" "Make me stop," she retorted coolly, "hurt me back." An electrified punch came sailing at his head. Coiling his shaky muscles, Peter rolled out of the way and backflipped into a poised stance. Sweat from a mixture of terror and shyness slipped down his skin and melted into his mask as he lifted his gaze to her skittishly. "Okay, see, here's the thing. I can't really do that because, why You what?" she growled, cartwheeling into a kick that he dodged with a sidestep. "Well, I haven't ever hit a girl, before." At his words, Natasha couldn't keep herself from smiling, and she laughed a little under her breath. She jerked her elbow back, narrowly missing his face, then wrapped her arm under his armpit and flipped him over her shoulder. He hit the floor hard with a grunt, then cried out in pain as another terrible shock ravaged his skinny body. Newsflash, kiddo. People of every sort do bad things and know how to kick ass. So if you don't have the balls to kick their ass back, gender regardless, bad times are coming your way. Her foot pegged him in the side, causing him to recoil, and she twisted his arm back and shoved him into the ground with her heel digging between his shoulder blades. Although he was a lot more flexible than your average Joe, she had him pretty well bent into a very painful pretzel, and seemed aware that she could stretch him past the typical human limit. On top of that, she followed by slamming her gauntlet against his back, and a third unbearable shock zapped him silly. Okay, enough was enough, and she had a valid point. He needed to learn how to fight people, any type of people. It was kind of necessary considering the whole crime-fighting persona he had adopted, and considering how many different kinds enemies he was likely to face. The fact was, he had never had any real battle training, and diving into this business lacking any experience, even with enhanced spider powers, was kind of stupid and undeniably reckless. Granted, those were some of his signature quirks, but he was willing to change that image. Especially now, when he was currently being forced to eat the floor and one more shock away from blacking out. Gritting through the agony, Peter threw his head back and hit Natasha right in the face. The blow made her grip loosen, and he tore his arm free, whipped his elbow against her stomach, rolled onto his back, and kicked her off his body. She dropped hard against the floor, and Spider-Man scrambled to his feet, bones still quaking under his flesh. "Oh shit," he said uneasily as she sat upright, blood dripping from her nose. He had wanted to make his point, but he didn't want to seriously injure her. They were on the same side outside of all this, right? "I'm really sorry. But you, and the twisting, and the hurting, and the shocking." Out of nowhere, Natasha snagged a trio of ninja stars from her utility belt and flung them straight at him. Alarmed, Spider-Man ducked to avoid one, rolled to the left to dodge the next, then bent over backwards to narrowly elude the last, the sound of the razors zipping past his body sending chills up his spine. When all three throwing stars had lodged themselves into the wall behind him, Peter turned back to Black Widow, rattled. Wait, I didn't mean to." Wordlessly, she pulled a knife from her boot and ran at him full speed. To his disbelief, she jabbed the blade right at his chest, and he barely jerked out of the way to avoid having his heart shish kebabbed. The razor's sharp edge whisked past his shoulder, slashed by to his belly, hissed in front of his nose, and Peter was leaping and ducking, twisting and bending, doing everything he could to steer clear of the deadly weapon. His spidey sense was screaming inside his head. "Oh God! This room is too small, I can't dodge forever." Growing hysterical, he scrambled sideways then sprung onto the wall. Just as he landed, however, Natasha seized the weapon firmly by the hilt and threw it at an angle. The knife flew, and before he could react in time, sliced a line across his forehead, then bounced off the wall and clattered to the ground at his feet. He gasped in shock, panting shakily, then terror rushed into his throat. Two daggers were clutched in Black Widow's fists, and she would be on him in seconds. He panicked. His fist swung. He pulled back on the supernatural power behind it at the last possible moment, slowing the punch as much as he could so it wouldn't be deadly, but he couldn't stop it in time. It nicked her jaw. That was enough. Her head snapped to the left, and she hit the ground. He stood pressed against the wall, panting. "Oh no," he whispered feverishly. He rose and stumbled over to her, sick with fear. "Shit. Agent R. Romanoff? Hey, Ms. Natasha?" He noticed suddenly that her shoulders were shaking. Oh, thank God. She was all right. But, was she crying? Duh, you slugged her in the face, asshole. He gingerly took hold of her arm, clueless as to what he should do. Then he heard the sound that was coming out of her. It was not weeping or wailing or even whimpering. Natasha Romanoff was, in fact, laughing. To his further disbelief, she slowly pushed off the floor and sat upright, still giggling slightly. Peter jumped back in fear. "Now that," she chuckled, reaching far into her mouth and ripping a bloody tooth more like it. He breathed in heavy gasps, wide-eyed. He stammered breathlessly. "You're okay, you're not upset?" "Well, I was kinda asking for it," she said, flicking the tooth across the room and swiping the back of her hand under her nose. I wanted to see what you would do. Tony was right. You pack quite a punch for such a little guy, even when you're really holding back. But you've still got a ways to go, kid. He slowly sat back on his haunches, blinking bewilderedly. You seriously almost killed me, like, 7 times just now for that? To make me punch you in the face? What the heck? Why? That's how I was trained. I was trying to make it authentic for both of us. This spar wasn't just for you, you know. She rubbed at her throbbing cheek tentatively, brow furrowed. But I wouldn't have killed you. Just some slight maiming. Oh, all right. That's comforting. I have no idea why I was ever worried. She turned to him at that moment, and a funny look spread across her face. A strange hybrid of amusement and something else. Was that? No, it couldn't be. Sympathy? Endearment? Before he could diagnose it for sure, Natasha ran her tongue over her lips and chuckled softly. All right, I think we're done here, she sighed, standing up with a slight catch in her movements. He scrambled to his feet reflexively, fearful of what other cruelty she might have in store for him, but she simply turned around and waved him forward with a hand over her shoulder. Come here. She strode across the room to a panel by the door and clicked one of the buttons. A compartment in the wall popped open, and she lifted a small first aid kit from inside. Hesitantly, he walked to stand behind her, right as a small bench unfolded out from the hole. She unfastened the clasps on the case, then pointed to the chair. Sit. Warily, he did what he was told. To his surprise, Natasha pulled a white cloth from the kit, wet it with alcohol, sat down beside him, then reached towards his face. He flinched back before she could touch him, however, heart hammering inside his chest. What are you doing? He asked uncomfortably. You're bleeding, she replied. Well, yeah. And whose fault is that? Yours for not ducking fast enough. Now hold still. You honestly expect me to sit here like everything's totally chill and stuff when you were trying to gut me 5 seconds ago? If you don't want that to get infected, then yes. Peter scowled. You don't get to doctor the wounds you just did to me. How do I know this isn't some kind of trick or trap, and that why you're not just trying to hurt me some more? He turned away bitterly. And anyways, I prefer patching myself up. Meaning you've never had anybody but yourself to do it, correct? Her words made his throat go dry and his face redden a little. She took his uncharacteristic silence as a yes, and a solemn smile pulled at the corners of her mouth. She spat a glob of blood onto the floor, and Peter watched her hand suddenly slip behind her back and into her belt. His body instantly tensed in anticipation. She eyed him in surprise, then snorted. Relax, okay? We're not fighting anymore. Here. She fished something from one of her many pockets and held it out to him. Spider-Man just stared at it confusedly. When he didn't move, she shoved it against his chest. It's chocolate. Take it and eat it. The candy bar dropped messily into his hands. He looked down at it for a moment, letting it fall flat in his palm, then glanced back up at her, puzzled. Okay. Why do you have this with you? Force of habit, thanks to Clint and his grubby little spawn, she responded with a chuckle. Wait, what? Clint Barton? As in Hawkeye? He has kids? No, a different Clint. Never mind. Quit asking questions and just eat it already. She wrung the medical cloth onto the floor, then nodded towards his cut. Now would you let me look at that? He studied her intently for a minute, struggling to deduct the Avengers' true intentions, but couldn't pull a good read on her. Without waiting for him to answer, she slipped the cloth through the tear in his mask and dabbed at the cut on his forehead. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, and despite the sting of the alcohol, the coldness was soothing. As he watched her work, chocolate bar in hand, only minutes after she had seemed hell-bent on carving him to pieces and was now tending to his wounds with delicate care, Peter was understandably a little out of sorts. Unable to stand the awkward silence, he swallowed down his fear. What's the deal with you, huh? Her attentive hands didn't falter. What? You know what? You drag me in here, beat me and zap me and slice me like your own personal punching bag. Then completely flip and start being all weird and nice. Is this your way of initiating newbies? By making them nearly piss themselves, then turning a two-faced 180? She grinned. Perceptive tyke, aren't ya? That wasn't battle training. That was something else. A test? Were you testing me? Or do you actually just hate my guts? I was trying to expose you to the hell you're getting yourself into. He glanced at her stony eyes curiously as she dug inside the medical bag. He hadn't noticed until now. Her face was decorated with multiple scars. Tiny, most unnoticeable behind her light makeup, but definitely there, and shockingly numerous. She had obviously seen her fair share of action and lived from one fight to the next, even without any superpowers. She knew what she was talking about. Peter lowered his gaze. Well, I didn't ask you to. I'm not stupid. I know this is dangerous. But I want to help people with my powers, because I've seen what happens when I don't step in. His hands fidgeted in his lap. And in a way, I've kinda already been through hell. Natasha smiled sadly as she unwrapped a bandage. I figured as much. If you hadn't experienced your fair share, you would have tucked tail the first 2 seconds. She pushed the torn fabric of his mask out of the way and pressed the gauze to his skin. But you're still too young and inexperienced to be fighting our wars. This is grown-up stuff, and you have no idea how susceptible you are to being used and exploited by the wrong people. Why exactly did you go to Germany with Stark? What were you there to fight for? As he thought it over, Peter felt his cheeks begin to flush against his mask. I was there to back his side. Cap and his team were acting recklessly and needed to be stopped. And it had nothing to do with the fact that Tony Stark, one of the most famous superheroes in the world, gave you a fancy new suit and personally asked for your help? And sorta threatened he'd tell my aunt. He remembered. He had never considered the possibility that he had been used by Mr. Stark in Germany. It was more than that, right? Peter Parker wasn't just a pawn to be summoned in his eyes, was he? No, he refused to believe it. Regardless, Natasha's message was clear. You're corruptible, Spider-Man. The only sensible thing you've done is wear a mask. You hold yourself back when people are trying to hurt you, and you put far too much faith in others. But, isn't that why we choose to fight for people? He countered. Because we still believe they deserve our help and protection. Natasha held his gaze for a long moment, then sighed helplessly. I know you're only trying to do the right thing and all. I just don't want to see you be swept into what I've seen happen to so many others, to me. She smoothed the bandage down, then let her hands drop into her lap. He sat beside her in silence, studying her expression inquisitively. Of all the things Peter had prepared himself for prior to facing off against Black Widow, this was the last thing he had anticipated. She didn't hate him, she was concerned about him, although she had a very strange way of showing it. There was more to her than just her deadly abilities and tough facade. A non-existent childhood, a haunted past. His gaze wandered around the room as he bit the inside of his cheek. You and Mr. Stark around to keep that from happening, right? He ventured timidly. He let a slow breath slip from his lips. I know I'm still really new to this, and that nobody thinks I'm ready for it. But I want to help people however I can, and I'm going to keep helping people no matter what anybody else thinks. The young hero blinked. But you guys have experience with all this that I don't. So maybe you can, guide me and stuff through all the craziness. We can train like this more often, he suggested, then faltered. Well, maybe not exactly like this. A slightly less physically and mentally scarring version of this. But, just whatever else you think might help. If you're, cool with that. Finally giving in, he peeled away the wrapper at the end of the chocolate bar and pulled his mask up past his nose. He bit a small piece off the corner and chewed it quietly, waiting for her response. A smile was quick to seize her features, and she gave a small shrug. I suppose I could manage that. If you're going to be a reckless little idiot, you might as well be a reckless idiot with a bit of direction. And I could use some extra practice fighting against enhanced folk, since more of you little bastards are popping up every day. He broke a wedge of chocolate from the bar and held it out to her. So it's a deal, then? Natasha glanced at the offering curiously, amused by the childish gesture, then gazed at the masked face staring up at her expectantly. She realized she had a chance with this headstrong kid to claim some redemption for the injustices done to her, and for those she had committed. Opportunities like this were incredibly far and fleeting. Her youth had been ripped away from her and perverted into something she could never be truly reconciled from, a permanent, red scar that marred her past and bled into the present. She had been turned into a monster, yet she still wondered to this day if it was the Red Room that had forced her to become one, or if the possibility had been inside her all along. Joining the Avengers and trying to right all her wrongs by protecting the world from other monsters wouldn't change what she was. The stains would always remain inside her, no matter what restitution she sought to cleanse them. But maybe by giving this boy what had been denied to her, guidance to refine one's abilities to be used for good rather than exploited by killers, she could keep someone else from enduring the horrors she had experienced, and help him become something great, something she could never be. So, exhaling softly, she accepted the chocolate from him and popped the piece into her mouth. "All right, deal." Tony was busy thumbing through some old suit designs when the doors across the room finally opened with a hiss. It had been almost 30 minutes now. Had they seriously been beating on each other this whole time? The first of the two to come out was Black Widow herself, marching her usual confident stride. A line of blood streaked along her lip. She was chewing on something as she walked past him, and appeared strangely triumphant. "Make sure he tends to the rest of his injuries," she instructed him over her mouthful. "I'm heading out." "What? Me? What did you do to him, Nat? Where are you going?" She filed cheerfully down the stairs without furnishing a reply. Stark watched her leave perplexedly, then swiveled back around in his chair to face the doors. A few seconds later, Peter Parker came staggering into the room, looking battered and a little unstable. He stepped through the doorway, then leaned off the wall, groaning and gripping his head in his hand. Immediately, Tony jumped to his feet. "Holy shit, kid. Are you all right?" He hurried to his side as Peter slowly placed all his weight back on his feet. Stark glanced over his shoulder to make sure they were alone, then pulled Spider-Man's mask off his head, revealing the bruised and bloody face underneath. It looked like Natasha had seriously wailed on him, but he was surprised to see that he was smiling. "I'm okay, Mr. Stark, honestly," he insisted with a light laugh. "I just stood up a little too quickly. And got electrocuted a few times. And punched. In the face." He held a half-eaten candy bar up to Tony's eye level. "Chocolate?" Stark knocked his hand away with a scoff. "I knew she was going to rough you up a bit, but this is a little extreme. Did she pull a knife on you?" His suit and the skin underneath were nicked with cuts in a few places, and the bandage on his forehead was saturated with red. "Jesus. If you didn't hate her before, you must really hate her now." "What, are you kidding?" he replied enthusiastically. "She's awesome. I mean, yeah, she acts all mean and tough at first, but she's actually really cool and nice. She even agreed to help me train some more later." "You agreed to lock yourself in a room with her again?" he gawked. "After what she just did to you?" "If it'll help me be a better superhero, then sure." Tony studied the teen's beaming face for a moment, trying to decide if he was actually being serious or not. Then, shaking his head, he couldn't help but chuckle. "Geez. You're nuts, kid. I think I know who I want to be when I grow up now." "Congratulations. I'm getting you some water." "Oh, okay. Thanks, Mr. Stark." He kneaded tenderly at his temple. "Do you also maybe have some aspirin?" "How many you need?" "I don't know. A lot, hey." "Alright. Does Clint Barton have kids?" "Nope. Barton lost his balls in a tragic helicopter accident." "What? Kidding. Ask him yourself. But first, clean yourself up, and lie your ass down before you topple over." Peter watched Tony step down the stairwell and disappear from sight. He could still hear him griping under his breath when he was 2 stories below. Finally alone, Peter puffed out his cheeks exhaustedly, then gave an amused chuckle. If Tony had been using him as his pawn back in Germany, things appeared to have changed since then. It was nice to have someone besides his aunt around who seemed concerned for his well-being, despite how foreign it felt. And, despite the aches and pains scattered across his body, he believed Natasha Romanoff cared likewise. She had a hard shell to crack, that was for sure. But he hoped he could eventually prove to her that he was more than the stubborn, reckless kid she believed him to be. And perhaps, in due time, she could prove to him that she was more than the cold-blooded assassin she sought to make everyone see her as. Plucking his web shooters off the floor, Peter dragged himself to the couch and flopped into the plush cushions with a sigh. He laid his forearm over his eyes and let the other hang messily off the edge, his fingers barely touching the carpet. When Tony came stomping back up the stairs a couple minutes later, a bottle of pills in his left hand and a glass of water in his right, he quickly discovered that he was too late. Spider-Man was already passed out in the living room, and he couldn't bring himself to wake him. So he left the supplies on the coffee table and went to his workspace in the other room, telling Friday to alert him whenever Peter left. But once Stark was gone, Natasha Romanoff strode up the staircase back to the penthouse floor, realizing she had left some of her weapons in the sparring area. When she found the skinny teen collapsed on the couch, face unmasked but decently hidden under his arm, she stopped with a start, then scoffed. The thought came to her mind before she could stop it. My God, he looks so young. And cute. In a dumb and disheveled sort of way. Then the Avenger noticed the tiny splotches of blood speckling the fabric beneath him, and she rolled her eyes with a huff. Stupid kid, she groaned, and snagged the first aid kit from the other room. She went to work patching him up the rest of the way as best she could, though subconsciously being quieter and gentler than normal so he wouldn't stir. When she was finished, she sat back with a sigh and watched his chest rise and fall with steady, rhythmic movements. Damn. Yetik, Spider-Man, she thought. A soft smile lifted her lips. Getting ourselves caught up in all this insanity so young. Hoping someday we might get to stand by the rest of these gods and heroes and call ourselves their equals. Like we actually deserve that title. Like we seriously have a shot. She gave his hair a light ruffle, then settled into the opposite corner of the couch, crossing her arms over her chest and letting her eyelids flutter shut. Well, maybe I'm projecting a little. Maybe one of us still has a chance. But hey, maybe I can help that someone along the way, maybe mentor them until they do reach that point. After all, as of now, you could really use a little guidance. Another rainy day. It was pouring rain outside. His aunt had insisted he bring an umbrella to school, quoting the daily forecast and rambling on about some ache in her knees, but he hadn't listened. Now he was really paying for it, and couldn't wait for the earful he was going to receive when he staggered back into their apartment, soaked to the bone and shaking like a leaf. On top of that, he was starving. He swore he'd never experienced this level of hunger before in his entire life. He would normally stop at his favorite sandwich deli for an after-school bite and snack for later, but had blown what little money he had on a new Star Wars poster Ned had goaded him into buying the day before. By now he had concluded it wasn't his smartest monetary investment. The growling in his tummy coupled with the icy downpour drenching him from above made for one hell of a dynamic duo, whose only goal seemed to be making him miserable. But he had to get home. His little field trip to Germany had really put him behind, and he had a shit ton of makeup work to slave over. There were a few tests he recalled needing to study for, too. Didn't high school teachers understand that he had other things to deal with besides writing essays about books he didn't care about and studying subjects that would never help him get ahead in life, or save a life, for that matter? He assumed that this was a predicament not a lot of other heroes found themselves in. Nonetheless, he shuffled down the dreary street that led to his apartment complex, arms hugged around his chilly body and crowds of bustling people brushing past him from every direction. Frigid water dripped off his hair, slithered down his spine, and soaked his clothing, making the heavy fabric adhere to his shivery flesh. The pounding of the rain against the asphalt mixed with the endless warble of passers-by invaded his ears and gave him a headache. Muddy yellow taxicabs crept along the edge of the sidewalk to his left, beckoning the sea of pedestrians with the promise of a warm and dry ride home that he didn't have the cash to afford. Perfect day to forget your Spidey suit, Pete, he thought dejectedly, shoving his hands into his soggy pockets. If he had remembered to wear it underneath his clothes, which he was trying to form a habit of doing, he could swing his merry way home in a quarter of the time it took him to walk there. But now, thanks to his forgetfulness and dumb secret identity and charming Parker luck, here he was, trudging through the flooded streets of Queens, taking the long and dismal walk of shame back to his building 5 blocks away. He stopped at a crosswalk as cars sped in front of him, belching clouds of exhaust and spraying water at his feet. People huddled around the curb impatiently, and he skirted along the outer circle to try to steal some second-hand relief beneath the edges of their umbrellas. His pursuits were found unsuccessful, however, and he soon gave up with drooping head and hunched shoulders, exhaling shakily. "Peter? Is that you?" He turned with a start at the voice and discovered that a sleek, black Maserati had pulled up at the stoplight beside the sidewalk. The passenger's side window slowly rolled down, revealing the sharply dressed driver inside as he slipped a pair of sunglasses off his face and squinted his eyes. "Holy crap, it is you. What the hell are you doing?" Peter's heart leapt into his throat when he realized who it was. Mr. Stark. Yeah. Hi. Wonderful weather we're having, huh? He swallowed and forced a nervous grin on his face, kicking at a grimy puddle pooled under his feet and trying to hide how painfully embarrassed he was. Oh, why yeah, hey. It's great, real great. He licked at the freezing water dripping from his lips and dug his elbows into his sides to keep himself from shivering. Where are you off to? Nothing special. A meeting with a couple friends of mine. His mouth curved into a slight smirk. And, where might you be headed? Me? Nowhere. Just, home. From school. Isn't that, like, a 20-minute walk from here? Something like that. It's fine. I'm a fast walker. It's 40 degrees out and pouring. Can't you get a taxi? He bit his cheek and lowered his gaze to the pavement, watching the droplets strike the earth in a relentless wave. Well. And no, I'm a bit short on, I accidentally left my wallet at home. That's all. I can be a real moron sometimes. But it's okay. I don't mind the rain, and I prefer walking anyway. Tony felt a pull in his chest, staring at the poor kid as he shivered in the freezing rain, knowing well the real reason why he had to tromp his way home despite the grueling conditions. He rubbed exasperatedly at the bridge of his nose, eyes squeezed shut, then dropped his hand against the steering wheel with a sigh, motioning him forward with his head. All right, come on. What? Come on. Let me give you a lift. Peter's cheeks went red. Oh, and no, you don't need to. I don't need. I'm perfectly fine, Mr. Stark. Honest. I'm totally good. I'm used to walking in weather way worse than this, and I don't want to get your nice car all gross and wet. Kid, he interrupted him pointedly, shaking his head, you're killing me. Just get in the damn car. By then, the walk sign had switched on, and the rest of the pedestrians gathered at the crosswalk were scurrying into the street, leaving Peter standing alone on the sidewalk. He watched them go uncertainly, torn between not wanting to bother Mr. Stark but also not wanting to endure the bitterly cold rain any longer. In that moment, as if just to spite him, a violent gust of wind blasted his body from behind, making him shrink feebly and quake with chills. Come on, the light's green, Tony called, popping the shotgun door open. You're causing a holdup. Get your ass in here before it freezes off. Peter glanced around the street, making sure no one he knew was around to see him conversing with the legendary Avenger, then exhaled defeatedly. Peeling his sopping hood off his head, he stepped into the fancy car and plopped into the passenger seat, carefully shutting the door after himself. A couple of agitated taxi drivers blared their horns at them before the Maserati zoomed through the intersection, leaving the desolate crosswalk behind. It was warm inside and smelled like expensive leather. The relief from the frigid hell outside was incredible. Clenching his teeth to keep them from chattering, Peter buckled himself in and settled back into the chair stiffly, watching droplets fall from his chin and form a puddle in the middle of his seat. Rain pounded against the windshield as the wipers swished wildly back and forth. Thank you, Mr. Stark. Yeah, Tony chuckled, scooping Peter's sopping backpack off the floor and tossing it into the back seat. Where's your umbrella? He combed his fingers through his hair sheepishly. Kitchen counter. Or with my aunt, which she'll probably have on hand as soon as I get home to beat my ass with. Oh, I'd pay to see that, Stark said with a snort. Cars puttered slowly on all sides as the traffic thickened around them. Well, lucky for you. The only punishment you're getting from my end is that you have to come with me to meet my friends now. Peter turned to him quickly. Huh? What friends? You'll see once we get there. An instant excitement welled inside his belly, but was almost immediately diminished by prickling uncertainty. Wait, is it people I know? Will they be expecting Peter Parker there? You know, a random high schooler? With Tony Stark? If not, don't you think your friends might get suspicious? I know I would be. And I'd kind of prefer to keep my secret identity. Well, a secret. A freezing droplet suddenly crawled down his spine, and he hugged himself with a shivery huff. I've got a lot of stuff I need to work on for the school days I missed, and my aunt is expecting me home. I'd really love to come, but it might be better if you just took me to my apartment. He faltered. To ask. You can study there with us, Tony countered with a careless wave of his hand. And I'll let your aunt know where you are so she won't pop a fuse and your ass can remain unbeaten, for now, anyway. But I really don't want anyone else to figure out who I am, he said again. What if they put 2 and 2 together? You're so paranoid, kid, he chuckled. But if you're really that worried about it, I have a suit you can put on to wear while we're there. You can hang with everyone as Spider-Man. He glanced up at Tony in surprise, unaware that that was even an option. What kind of friends were these people? Presumably, or hopefully, ones he and Stark could trust. The idea of doing his homework with a bunch of Mr. Stark's pals in his Spider-Man costume sounded a little weird, but also really fun. His anxiety vanished hesitantly, and he wiped a drop of rain off his nose with an enthusiastic grin. Oh. Okay. I mean, if you insist. I'm down. Sounds neat. They pulled up to a stop sign as hordes of students scuttled across the road in front of them, shrouded under a cloud of colorful umbrellas. Stark huffed irritably as the two of them waited for the herd to pass. Geez. Look at all these little hooligans. You couldn't have asked any of them for a ride? Not a lot of New York teenagers have cars, Mr. Stark, he giggled. Especially high school sophomore New York teenagers. How about someone who could at least share their umbrella with you? Peter's face grew hot in response, and he fiddled distractedly with the cords dangling from his hoodie. Well. Yeah. I could've, but I didn't know it was raining until I got outside. And I didn't want to have to, go back in and find someone. And I was sorta in a hurry, so I figured I'd just be wasting more time by wandering around. Good God, kid, do you even have any friends? He chuckled shyly. That wasn't it. I have friends. Great friends. Ned and Abraham and all of them. They just weren't around is all. And, well, the only person I sorta know from my last period is Liz, but I was not about to ask her. Liz? Peter glanced up at Tony confusedly, noticing the keen glint that had entered the man's eyes even though they remained locked on the road, then quickly stared back down at his hands. Yeah, Liz Allen. Who's that? My friend. Well, sorta. I'm in academic decathlon with her, but we don't really talk much. Really? How come? He shrugged without looking up. I don't know. I don't know. It's a big school. And we each hang out with our own friend groups and stuff. So that's why you didn't ask if you could share her umbrella? Well, no, I just figured she had other friends to walk or ride with, and she probably doesn't know me all that well, so I thought it'd be kinda weird or rude or something just to, go right up and… He stopped himself suddenly, realizing he was rambling, and turned to Mr. Stark sharply, puzzled. Wait, why are you asking me all this? Tony smirked. Just curious. You're acting like asking this nice little friend of yours for a favor is such a big deal. It's not. I mean, it wouldn't have been. I don't know. I just didn't feel like it. I mean, you know how dumb people can be. They see you with someone for, 5 seconds, and immediately start getting these stupid ideas in their heads. Ideas? Stark repeated knowingly. The Maserati rolled to a stop at another streetlight, the engine purring. What kind of ideas? I don't know. Stupid ones, like that you might like this Liz Allen girl? Tony watched the teen's cheeks immediately flush with color, and he turned to him with flustered movements. What? No, that wasn't what I don't. We aren't, she isn't. Holy crap, you do. And no, I don't, it's nothing like that. Oh my god, can we just talk about something else? Like that Mets game last week, am I right? Or have you made any cool new suits recently? How's the family? Hell no, this is the most pressing matter of my day. Little Pete's got a crush. Peter dropped his face into his hands with a groan. Really, Mr. Stark? Now you're the one making stupid assumptions. No, I'm not. You obviously like this girl but have no idea how to deal with it. Fortunately, you parked yourself right next to the world's leading expert on ladies, dating, and schmoozing. And it is my civic duty to pass my knowledge unto you, young one. Please stop, Peter giggled embarrassedly through his fingers. I don't want any. Well, clearly you need some if the girls at your school aren't lining up to take a bite out of you. He gave his head a playful shove. Look at that face. How badly versed in the female species do you have to be to discourage them from drooling over that? Walking home suddenly doesn't sound so bad anymore. No need to stop the car. Just roll down a window. Tony chuckled amusedly and patted him on the shoulder. "Ah, come on, kid. I'm just trying to help. Have you ever even had an actual girlfriend?" Peter bit the inside of his cheek, burning beneath his wet clothes. "Well, as astonishing as this may seem, Mr. Stark, I'm not exactly a member of the popular crowd at my school. So no, I haven't. And probably won't anytime soon. I don't have time for something like that, anyway." "Oh my God, Peter. You're in the golden age of your life right now. If you don't have time for girlfriends at this point, you never will." While one hand continued steering the wheel, Tony reached the other into the glove box and snagged a bag of chocolate candies. "You're a good kid. You deserve to let loose, be normal every now and then. So if you like this Liz girl, which you do, grow a pair and ask her out." He scratched the back of his head sheepishly. "Well, about that. She's, sorta already, with someone else." "Ooh," Stark exclaimed with a grin. "I see. So now the truth is unveiled. You waited too long to make a move, and now she's been swept up by some other asshole. You gotten yourself into quite the pickle, haven't ya?" The blush in the teenager's face reached his ears, and he watched the rain drip down the window to avoid his gaze. "The fact that you're not running your mouth is a dead giveaway, in which case my advice still stands. Screw this other guy and ask her out. You got this. You're a freaking superhero." "Why yeah, but she doesn't know that," he retorted quietly. "Nobody does. And I don't want anyone to. My life would be completely flipped upside down, pun intended. And it could put a lot of people I care about in danger." He rubbed his hands together in his lap. "Plus, if I did want someone to like me, or whatever, I wouldn't want it to be just because of that. I'd want them to like me just for me, you know?" Tony sighed heavily. "Always gotta be the little saint, huh?" He tossed a handful of chocolates into his mouth, chewing as he spoke. "Unfortunately, the good guys never get the girls, especially in high school. So either you drop the baby-faced angel act and steal back Ms. Allen from Mr. Second Rate, or settle for a life of unspoken feelings and crippling loneliness." Peter rolled his eyes and sat back with a laugh. "Wow, okay. Thanks, Mr. Stark. I forgot who I was talking to for a sec. I think I'll try figuring this stuff out my way. By avoiding it for as long as possible." Tony Stark gave a casual shrug of his shoulders as he munched on his snack, clearly having a very different set of ideals in mind when it came to the concept of dating. Peter watched the billionaire playboy in quiet awe, remembering for a moment just how amazing it was that he was sitting next to him and wondering what it must be like to be in the man's shoes, oozing confidence and sought after by millions, men and women alike, both inside and outside of his suit. Tony Stark was just as if not more admired as Iron Man, because they were one and the same. Peter Parker, on the other hand, was a nobody, even in the pathetic context of high school. Socially speaking, his confidence was clouded into the negatives when girls were added to the equation. But as for Spider-Man, well, that was a little more complicated. He felt more confident and acted more confident when donning his spandex sporting alternate ego because he became just that. Someone entirely separate from the timid teenager behind the mask. Nobody knew who he was, so he could be whoever he wanted to be, aka, the witty, bold, outspoken version of himself that he'd normally keep safely bottled up inside. In his head, Peter Parker and Spider-Man were not the same entities like Tony Stark and Iron Man were, but in a way he found that liberating. He could continue his life as a quiet, nerdy kid in the background of a bigger picture, but also put on a crazy costume and be the daring hero he had always dreamed of being. He could do the good deeds he felt called to through both, whether that involved being a friend to a fellow outcast or saving a person from being hit by a truck. But the actions he carried out as Spider-Man were on a much bigger scale and drew a lot more attention from the large world he lived in, and thus were subject to far greater scrutiny. Especially now, in the aftermath of his involvement in the Avengers battle in Germany. He really didn't want that attention on Peter Parker. He didn't understand how Mr. Stark dealt with it. So he would stick with the path he had chosen, and keep Spidey and Pete on separate playing fields. Even if that meant Peter Parker staying unpopular and girlfriend-less for the time being. As he sat adjacent to Tony in the luxurious car, still sopping wet and a bit chilly, his thoughts on the matter were bluntly interrupted by a smell that hit him like a slap in the face. He immediately recognized its source: chocolate, from the little bag Mr. Stark was eating out of. It was the fancy kind with all sorts of flavored fillings. His heightened senses made the aroma seem to flood over him from every direction until it felt as though the whole car was dripping with it, and that was the only thing that his mind could focus on. Now, this wouldn't normally have been a problem, except that the delicious smell reminded him of the fact that he was freaking starving. The gnawing hunger he'd been suffering from all day reawakened inside him with a vengeance, and he clenched his teeth together behind his lips. Holy crap! What's going on with me? All right. Enough love talk, Stark murmured, dumping the rest of the chocolate into his palm and crumpling up the bag. How about some music? What are you crazy kids into these days? You like Black Sabbath? He cranked the radio up half a turn, and Peter physically flinched. Whatever it was, he couldn't even tell, was unbelievably loud. Or maybe it wasn't. It just seemed that way to his overly sensitive ears. Regardless, the pounding bass made his head feel like it was about to pop, and he squeezed his eyes shut in agony. I'm more of an AC/DC fan myself, but they've put out some great stuff too. What do you think? Tony turned to see Peter pressing his hands to his ears and hunching his shoulders. The kid looked like he had a migraine the size of Manhattan. Mr. Stark, I see can't, it's too. He shook his head fervently. Could you please turn it down? Tony blinked. The music was barely above what he considered to be typical in car rock band volume. But, aware of how pained his young passenger looked, he quickly twisted the knob back. Oh. Yeah. Sure. The hammering drums and screeching guitars went silent, and after a long hesitation, Peter gingerly took his hands away from his ears, opening his eyes and huffing with relief. So, guess that's a no then. Sorry, he apologized shyly, rubbing his forefinger into his temple. My senses have been seriously out of whack lately. Everything seems so much louder and more intense than it used to be. I'm sure it's great, Mr. Stark. I'm more of an alternate, indie sort of guy myself, but hey, I can totally belt out the entire Bohemian Rhapsody, if that's still considered cool. Ignoring the kid's excessive blabbering, Tony wrinkled his brow. Damn. That sucks. Hopefully that goes away, or you'll never be able to go to another concert in your life. Peter was about to mumble something about never going to a concert before nor anticipating having the funds to attend one anytime soon, except now that one sensory assailant was out of the way, his first tormentor returned full force. The tortuous smell of velvety chocolate seized him once again, and he felt his stomach moan pleadingly inside him, threatening to collapse in on itself if he didn't grant it some form of sustenance. He could hardly believe how unbearable the hunger he was experiencing at that moment was. Oh my God. This isn't normal, is it? Does this have something to do with my powers too? Heightened metabolism rate or something? I think I read somewhere that Captain America had to deal with that after being pumped full of super soldieriness. Maybe since I have powers now, I had to deal with it too? Whatever the cause, he couldn't endure the terrible emptiness in his gut another second. He watched Tony pop the last pieces of candy into his mouth and lick the tips of his fingers as if just to mock him, and finally caved. Hey, Mr. Stark? He asked carefully, gripping his belly in his fingers. What's up? He swallowed, feeling his face grow warm. This meeting we're going to. Will there be, like, I don't know, snacks or whatever? Lunch type stuff? Something of that genre? Tony furrowed his brow in response. I'm not sure. Lunchtime was, like, 2 hours ago, so I wasn't exactly planning on it. Peter leaned back into his chair sheepishly. Right. But, hypothetically speaking, if someone had sorta not had lunch yet, would there be anything there for them to just, snack on? Peter winced when Stark turned on him, his face scrunched with confusion. You haven't? What? Why not? Drawing nervous circles in his soggy jeans, the teen shrugged. Well, you see, mine was sort of, incidentally, misappropriated. You've got to be kidding me right now. Yeah, I know, right? 11 years of school. Just so I could learn to use those 2 SAT-level words somewhat correctly in the same sentence. Someone stole your lunch? Well, more like I gave it to him in exchange for a humiliation-free class period. One day in chemistry without any penis Parker comments, worth it. I'm literally about to throw you out of my car, Stark said. You're Spider-Man. You could have torn this dude's balls out and made him eat them in 3 seconds flat. Well, 2 seconds, if I'm close enough. But, see, the thing is, he's been a jerk to me since freshman year. And if I, the once helpless and pitiful dork, suddenly started standing up to him, I could draw some unwanted attention to myself. So I do whatever I can to not cause a scene." Tony cupped his palm over his eyes, then slowly dragged his hand down his face. "You're the most frustrating thing I've ever had to deal with. I don't get you at all. Is keeping your spidery secret really that important?" "To me, yes, it is." He exhaled heavily and ran his fingers through his hair, trying not to sound as desperate as he actually was. "But, hey, you know what's more important to me than that at this particular moment? Food, and its estimated quantity at our current destination." "You're unbelievable. We'll stop somewhere and get something." Peter's eyes widened. "What? Wait, Mr. Stark, you don't— I wasn't trying to." His stomach released a long, painful growl at that moment, making him wince sheepishly. Kid, there's a burger place at the next corner. We're stopping." The resolved look that had gripped the Avenger's face made it clear there was no point in trying to talk him down, and Peter wasn't sure if he should be grateful or intimidated. He decided for once to actually do as he was told. Sit back in defeat and shut his stupid trap. Because, in all honesty, the prospect of getting a burger at that point was an offer he would do anything NLED against the curb. Tony fished his wallet out of his coat pocket. "Here, run inside real fast and get whatever you want." He thumbed a couple 20s from a stack and held them out to him. "And a cheeseburger for me with everything on it." I should have enough to pay for myself," Peter insisted skittishly. "Or at least to dampen the cost." He reached into his pants pocket, knowing he had some loose change he could scavenge from somewhere, and pulled a handful of coins out. Unfortunately, he did so a little too hastily, and nickels, pennies, and quarters alike sprung from his hand and scattered around their feet. He grimaced, listening to the change ping shrilly against the floor, and gingerly unfolded his fingers to reveal the 2 dirty pennies that he'd managed to keep a grip on. Tony exhaled listlessly. "Just take it," he said, shoving the bills into his open palm, "before you give me an ulcer or something." Heavily chagrined, Peter accepted the cash and stepped out of the car, hurrying into the burger joint to avoid further embarrassing himself and further waterlogging. Stark rested his chin on his hand as he watched him go, barely stifling a laugh. Inside, the thick stench of salt and grease was tortuous. His thoughts were immediately swallowed by one aim and one aim only. Get yourself a damn burger. Mouth-watering, he drifted unconsciously to the cash register and slammed the wad of notes on the counter, at which the cashier looked down upon surprisedly. "Can I help you, sir?" Why yeah," he stammered, licking his lips. "Could I get a cheeseburger? With everything on it?" The woman smiled artificially. "Sure," she replied, tapping at the keypad with her long fingernails. "Anything else?" He knew for a fact he was going to need more than that to appease his own agonizing hunger. He was already pretty spun up over the many ways he'd made a fool of himself in front of Mr. Stark for the past 15 minutes, and what he wanted to do would only add to that, but at this point, he didn't care. The damage was done, and he was famished. "Yeah," he said hesitantly, rubbing at his arm. "I'll take, 5 more of those." "5? Yes please. And a side of fries." She blinked twice, glancing down at the money then back up at him. But, eventually regaining her senses, she shook her head and typed in his order. "So that's 6 cheeseburgers and 1 large fry." "Yep." "Is that all?" "Yep. $34.82. He slid her the money, and she gave him his change and the receipt. 5 excruciating minutes later, out came his order, which he retrieved like a firstborn child and sped away with rapidly, doing his best to not look like the starved, soaking hobo he felt like. He climbed back into the car and flopped into his seat with the bag in his lap. Nothing seemed to matter except getting the food in front of him into his mouth right now. His aunt had a pet peeve about people eating on the way home after getting takeout and would have a fit if she saw him sneak a fry or 2 before they were both settled at the table in their apartment, but in that moment, he couldn't care less. He had missed breakfast and lost his lunch. He hadn't had a single morsel of nourishment that day. The stabbing ache in his belly was insufferable. The smell was too much. With shaky movements, he grabbed a burger from the stack, tore off the foil, and took a huge, ravenous bite. It was so amazingly good, so indescribably delicious, so intensely satisfying he wanted to cry. He finished off the first in about 10 seconds, and quickly unwrapped another as his stomach begged for more. So were you planning on sharing any of that, or am I just supposed to enjoy the show? Snapping out of his cheesy euphoria, Peter turned to Tony, who was watching him with a smirk. He quickly swallowed and painted a shy smile on his face. Oh, sorry. He pulled a burger from the bag and held it out to him. Stark accepted it with wary amusement. As soon as that was taken care of, the teen went straight back to gorging himself, inhaling 2 more sandwiches in a matter of minutes. Tony couldn't believe how much food such a little guy could put away so fast. He was eating like he hadn't had a meal in years. Do you always down 5 burgers at once? He asked, peeling the wrapper from his own and taking a reasonable bite. How the hell are you not a fat ass by now? Peter snorted and shook his head. I didn't used to, but now it seems like I can never eat enough. I don't ever feel full anymore. It's really annoying. He polished off his 4th cheeseburger and snatched up the last one, approaching it with just as much zeal as the first. Luckily, I've been able to convince my aunt that it's all just teenager stuff and hormones or whatever. So she's not too weirded out by it. Well, not yet. You're a mess, Tony concluded. He switched the car to drive, then whipped back into the stream of traffic, munching steadily on his single burger. Are you sure that's going to be enough? Unable to reply over his large mouthful, Peter simply nodded. I hope so. If we get to the tower and you start eating my couch or something, I'm gonna be pissed. Peter's eyes suddenly lit up. He swallowed forcefully. Wait. The meeting's at Avengers Tower? Are you kidding me? No way? Who's all going to be there? Will Cap be there? Do you think he could help me with my homework? I have to write an essay about World War II. Could I list him as a source? I doubt my teacher would believe it, but that would be awesome. Relax, kid, alright? Tony said, trying not to laugh at his lively enthusiasm. You'll see when we get there. Just be cool, Kay. You're a lot to handle all at once. He pressed his fingertip to a tiny pad on the armrest, opening a small compartment, which housed a neatly folded costume inside. Stark lifted it out and threw it at Peter, who caught it with a start. In the meantime, why don't you crawl to the back and put that on? We'll be there in 5. He wondered for a moment how many of these Spidey suits Tony Stark had just lying around, but quickly pushed the thought aside. Grinning, Peter unclipped his seatbelt and climbed into the belly of the car, slipping off his shoes and pulling his sopping shirt over his head as Avengers Tower rose like a beacon in the distance. Peter had been to the tower a couple of times before, but for the most part, the place was usually empty. Mr. Stark and Black Widow were the only Avengers he had seen there. It was kind of sad, considering how full and lively the building used to be. Nervous excitement rushed through him as he and Tony ascended the stairwell. He had a terrible urge just to skitter up the wall, but decided that walking like a normal human being was the more appropriate approach. He munched anxiously on the last of his French fries. After climbing 2 flights, Tony stepped onto the floor, which looked like an insanely rich person's version of a lounge. A man was sitting at a table with a deck of cards in his hand, and when he turned to see Stark entering the room, a smile broke across his face. Do you show up late to everything you go to, or just the things that involve me? Mr. Stark chuckled cheerfully. Everything, but I go the extra mile to make sure I'm extra late for you. With effort, the man lifted from his seat, leaning heavily off the table. Peter noticed that his legs had some kind of contraptions on them. Metal, high-tech, sort of Stark-y looking. He knew he recognized him, but couldn't pinpoint when or where for sure. Tony crossed the room hurriedly and gave the man a hearty hug, wrapping his arms under his shoulders to help hold him upright. Take it slow, old man, Stark said, masking his concern behind a smile. I don't need you collapsing on my floor and me having to page life alert or whatever. Give me a little credit, he insisted, straining a bit but managing to stay steady. My trainer's practically a miracle worker, and these braces have really helped. I can almost walk on my own again. That's great. I'm glad to hear it. But damn it, Roda'd take me a solid week to find another drinking bud as decent as you. Hilarious. Still rooted at the foot of the stairs, Peter snapped his fingers. Rhodey. Stirred from their reunion, the 2 men turned towards the voice, discovering the red and blue figure standing on the other side of the room. Realizing that all attention had redirected to him, he flinched slightly. Oh, sorry. I was trying to figure out where I knew you from. And now I remember. Rhodey. Colonel James Rhodes. War Machine, right? Major fan. We kind of met already. At the fight thing in Germany, remember? It's okay if you don't. I'm not really. I have one of those faces. Well, masks. I guess, in this situation. Don't mind me. I'll just be, over here, working on things. Tony and Rhodey exchanged a look as he swung his backpack off his shoulder and placed it on a coffee table. While he pulled some papers out and scattered them across the glass, Rhodes smiled. Yeah. I remember you. Peter perked up. You do? You stopped me from crashing into the plane, and you helped us bring down that huge guy. Yeah, that was me. Good times. Tony snorted and rolled his eyes. Get over here, kid, come on. Blinking in surprise, Peter carefully laid his homework down and strode across the room to where the two of them stood. Stark roped an arm around the teenager's shoulders. Rhodey, this is, Spidey. Spider-Man, the crime-fighting vigilante guy the first was telling you about. I brought him along just 'cause I figured you two should get to properly meet after everything. He helped us out when Cap was being a dick, so I gave his suit and tech some upgrades. But he's a spaz and wants to keep his identity a secret, so he'll be wearing his mask while he's here. Smiling warily, Rhodey held out his hand. Spider-Man, huh? Peter reluctantly took it and gave it a shake. The man's grip was very firm and commanding. Why yeah. Yes sir. Nice to meet you. You sound more like a kid than a man. How old are you? How old? Do I look? I'll go get us some scotch. Not you. You guys. Just hang out. Small talk. Don't break anything. Stark helped Rhodey back into the chair, then disappeared into the other room. Now it was just the two of them, and Peter found himself scrambling to think of something mildly pertinent to discuss. He scratched the back of his head. So, Mr. Rhodes. Colonel Rhodes. Just call me Rhodey, he insisted with a chuckle. Oh, okay. Rhodey. So, do you like? He eyed the deck of cards in his hand, and the words tumbled out of his mouth before he could stop them. Go fish? Rhodey laughed out loud. I'm more of a poker or blackjack kinda guy. Okay. Gotcha. Go fish? Seriously? You're the worst, Peter. Leaning back in his chair, Rhodey furrowed his brow. So how long have you known Tony? Mr. Stark? Not very long. A little less than a month. He tilted his head to the side. You? Hey. Too long. Oh, I didn't know that was possible. He can be a lot to deal with. He's got good intentions, but he makes a lot of dumb decisions. He lifted his gaze to meet his. Like recruiting a kid to fight in a grown-up's battle. Peter caught on quickly to what he was alluding to, and blinked in surprise. Oh, you mean? Well, just because I'm under 40 doesn't mean. Don't get me wrong. You handled yourself remarkably well. You're smart, real smart, and you've got a lot of potential. But Tony shouldn't have brought you to that fight. It was selfish and reckless of him. You understand that, right? Why is this the first thing brought up every time I talk to you guys? Peter murmured crossly under his breath. Sudden anger burned at the tip of his tongue. Yeah, I get it. It was stupid. I'm stupid. Is that what you want me to say? I can't change what happened. Mr. Stark asked for my help, so I came and helped. Just like everyone else who was there. Why do you even care if it was stupid? If you think I'm stupid, then just let me be stupid. I'm not your problem, and you don't have the right to lecture me like I am. The surprise on Rhodey's face made Peter's stomach grow icy with shock. His frustrations had come pouring from his lips before he'd been able to think them through. Stunned by his own crassness, Spider-Man dropped his gaze to the floor, bristling with shame. Oh God. I'm so sorry. I wasn't trying to be rude. He swallowed nervously and walked back to the coffee table, gathering a pile of crinkled papers in his arms. I'm tired of being preached to by people who don't even know me as if they know what's best for me, just because I'm new to this. Rhodey studied the boy curiously as he scooped up some books and dug around in his backpack for a pen. An immediate sympathy for the young hero grew in his heart. James didn't know anything about this guy outside of what Tony had told him. Spider-Man was a kid who'd gained powers who was trying to use them for good. And, despite what he'd gathered from the past few minutes, the kid had a point. Rhodes didn't know him. No one except Tony knew who he really was behind the mask, and even he probably didn't have the full story. He could imagine how annoying it would be to have every other hero you spoke with dumping their advice on your head just because you were young, and not because they knew you and understood your faults. He didn't want to be seen as just another asshole spouting rhetoric in the kid's eyes. That was the last thing he needed. "Hey," he called, changing his tone. Spider-Man glanced back up at him. With very careful movements, Rhodey reached across the table and pushed out the other chair. Catching the signal, Peter sighed, then crossed the room again. Rhodey nodded towards the empty seat, and he eased into it reluctantly. "I get it. You've had this conversation a lot, haven't you? The same rundown from every other hero you've met with?" When Spider-Man didn't reply, he crossed his arms against his chest. "You're right, okay, I don't have the right to talk to you like that. I'm sorry, it's a bad habit of mine. I'm used to being the one shouting orders and telling people what to do and how to do it." He chuckled and leaned back into his chair. "I feel like a lot of us old dudes don't know how to handle someone who's so much younger than us but probably packs 10 times the punch. So our first instinct is to just start bombarding you with advice because our experience is the only leverage we've got over you. Does that make sense?" Peter held his study materials close to his chest. I guess so. I think we have good intentions. We just go about it the wrong way. Seeing someone like you join the bloodbath is kinda scary, and we don't want something bad to happen in consequence. That's all." He shook his head dismissively. "But screw that. Let's just talk like a couple of regular guys, supersuits and age discrepancies aside." His eyes wandered down to the kid's hands, and he pointed at the papers. "What's all that for?" Spider-Man was relieved that he had changed the subject, but was not particularly thrilled over his choice of direction. He glanced at the bundle of pages. "Oh, these are, assignments. Things I have to work on, and complete, at home." Rhodey scoffed in disbelief. "Oh my god, you still have to do homework? I mean, I haven't tried asking my teachers to cut me a break since I started climbing walls and fighting baddies in spider-themed spandex yet. Maybe I should get a doctor's note." "Oh man, that's hilarious," he chuckled, but also kinda sad. "So far, the latter seems more true," he giggled lightly, especially after the Germany thing. "I'm so behind." "What are you working on now?" Rhodey asked. Giving in, Peter spread the papers across the table. "Algebra, chemistry, world history." He listed cheerlessly. "You wouldn't happen to have a deep, insightful understanding of the international climate surrounding World War II, would you? I've got an essay that will be the death of me." Rhodey chuckled. "I've got a pretty degree was one of my favorite subjects back in high school. I could lend you a hand with the other stuff too, unless you'd prefer Tony's help instead. Or you could try asking his weird little robot friend." Peter narrowed his eyes. "Weird little, what? Who's that?" "No, I don't know what would happen. I imagine you just process it like a regular person. Can you even get drunk? I'd love to test that." At that moment, Tony Stark came waltzing back into the room, a bottle in one handle and 2 glasses between his fingers. And, to Peter's surprise, he had company. A very tall, strangely dressed company. When he realized who it was, Spider-Man jumped to his feet. "What the? Oh, hey. You remember Spider-Man from Germany, right?" Before his friend could reply, Peter ran up to meet him, blinking bewilderedly. "Whoa, I remember you. You're that. The dude who shoots lasers out of his forehead or something, right?" The man smiled slightly. "That is one of my abilities, yes. His name is Vision," Tony explained. "He's one of our more recent additions to the team. Well, what's left of it." His accent sounded eerily familiar. Peter's eyes combed over the strange man's face, clothing, and skin, which all had an artificial-looking symmetry and flawlessness to them that he hadn't had the time to notice during the airport battle. Spider-Man looked him up and down, and was instantly racked with curiosity. His flesh was reddish-purple, his irises were laced with geometric patterns and lines, and his outfit was startlingly luxurious and detailed. There was only one explanation he could come up with. "Are you an alien?" Stark snorted with laughter. "Oh, right. I never really explained him to you, did I?" "In a sense, you are correct," Vision replied, tapping at the yellow stone on his forehead. This part of me here is not of this world, and contains powers far beyond it. The rest of me, however, is comprised of earthly substances. Peter stood on his tiptoes to get a better look at the shimmering jewel, intrigued. Wow. That's insane. Dude. How come only the rock is alien and not your whole body? Where were you born? Are you a human-alien hybrid? How'd that get on your face? Vision wasn't born, per se, Tony said, shrugging. I made him. Well, more like Ultron forced Helen Cho to make his body, and I installed a modified form of my old AI's matrix to its system. Did you ever hear about him? Jarvis? Spider-Man turned to Tony in shock. He's Jarvis. Wait, how did you? It's not as complicated as you might think, Vision interrupted him calmly. I am simply a vibranium-synthesized android powered by the Mind Stone with a consciousness based off of but independent from the intelligence once possessed by Mr. Stark's Jarvis. That hardly cleared things up for him, but Peter was too busy being awestruck to care. Wow, that's so cool. Are you actually considered alive? Can you vote? Are you even legal? Holy crap. Effortlessly, Spider-Man fired a web line onto the ceiling and flipped upside down, dangling from the thread just above Vision's eye level so he could see him from a better angle. Do you think the same way human beings do? Right now, at this very moment, what's going through your synthetic brain synapses? Vision smiled amusedly. I am thinking you are a very strange little person, he replied, rising off the floor and hovering a few inches higher than Spider-Man's head. You ask a lot of questions. And that costume of yours is odd. Peter laughed. Well, that's an issue you'll have to take up with its designer. Although, you're one to talk. Mr. Billowing Cape and Blue Tiara. Then he drew back sheepishly, hunching his shoulders. Hey, except you're somehow able to pull it off where it actually looks cool. And, oh my god, I forgot. You can fly. He can do a lot more than that, kid, Tony interceded with a chuckle. But right now, I think Viz is due for a break. He's been working non-stop on reconfiguring my arc reactor design into a more stable model. No such luck, but I'm sure we'll score eventually. But speaking of work, don't you have some you need to be doing right now? Ripped from his temporary relief of neglecting his obligations, Spider-Man withered dejectedly. Oh, right, thanks for reminding me. Rhodey and I have to talk over some things, Stark continued, passing between them and walking to the table again. If you need anything, we'll be on the couch. He helped Rhodey to his feet and guided him to the living area in the far corner of the room, scotch on hand. Releasing a dismal sigh, Peter dropped from the ceiling and turned back towards the hell awaiting him at the table, wondering where he should even begin with all that he had to get done, when a hand fell on his shoulder. You are young for a human, aren't you? Puzzled, he turned to face Vision, an all too familiar irritation pooling behind his lips. I mean, that's what everyone keeps telling me. So sure, yeah, I guess. Yet you're remarkably smart, he noted, twisting the webbing still hanging in front of his face around his finger. Mr. Stark told me how you created this versatile substance and its launching mechanisms all on your own, and the ways I've witnessed you utilize them have been quite impressive. Peter's eyes wandered down to his web shooters, which Tony Stark had made based off his designs, and he ran his fingers over them. Thanks. You also have incredible powers, but you use them very responsibly, with no intention towards cruelty or killing. That alone earns my respect. He was surprised to say the least. He was expecting this conversation to take a very different and much more unpleasant turn. A compliment was not what he was anticipating, and a careful smile spread across his face. Wow, thank you. He shrugged. I try, you know. I understand your difficult position, Vision told him earnestly. He held his hand in front of his eyes, curling his fingers as they steadily desaturated and faded until they were almost completely invisible. I am a naive creature with mysterious and magnificent abilities. Abilities that, if used for destructive purposes, could be devastating to humanity and all life on this world. My existence, therefore, is met with great speculation, and whether I am capable of using my abilities for good is a question I face every day. Am I deserving of this power? Can I control it, and channel it towards preserving life and seeking peace? He stared down at his formless hand with a thoughtfully somber expression. His eyes narrowed a little as he flipped his palm upright. Then his flesh's density bloomed back into his fingers, and he curled his hand into a fist. That remains to be seen. Peter had never expected to be able to relate to someone like Vision. He seemed so strange and intimidating from afar, but in reality was a lot more approachable than a lot of people Peter knew, even with his crazy costume and amazing power. He couldn't find the words to express his jumbled, grateful thoughts. Before he even had the chance to try, Vision placed his hand on his shoulder again. "Forgive me, Spider-Man. I do not mean to keep you from your work. I just wanted to assure you that you are not alone in your struggles to navigate your youth while having powers, all while seeking the trust of your peers. If you are in need of any assistance for your endeavors, know that you can come to me." He released his shoulder with a small nod, then strode around him with broad, confident steps. Peter stood facing the wall in silence for a moment, a little starstruck. Another Avenger was now offering him their help with this whole teenage superhero ordeal. Except Vision's was not coming from the fearful or disparaging point of view he was used to. Vision wanted to help him because he understood his frustrations and was dealing with the same criticisms he was. In about 4 seconds, Spider-Man's trust and respect for the peculiar hero had soared, and he suddenly found himself wanting to talk with him for hours on end. Coming to his senses, Peter spun back a bit stiffly. Hey, Mr. Vision, sir?" Vision glanced at him over his shoulder, hovering hardly an inch off the carpet. "Yes?" Over 1,000 questions were pushing at the back of his throat in that moment. Some to do with Vision's insanely awesome powers, others about Ultron and Jarvis and the stone on his head, and even more regarding his time spent fighting with and alongside the Avengers, especially Thor. A being with an infinite amount of knowledge was standing before him, after all. But, aware of the more pressing predicament he was currently faced with, he settled for just one. "Could you maybe, help me with my homework?" Vision blinked. "Homework? Why yeah, see," he continued, running back to the table and flipping through one of his books. "I'm in school, and I have to study some stuff and complete a few assignments, and I thought you could, help me if I get stuck or whatever. If that's, included with the kind of assistance you're offering." After a moment, Vision smiled. "That wasn't exactly what I had in mind when I said, assistance," he admitted, walking to his side and scanning over the stacks of papers strewn in front of him, "but I will try to help you however it is you desire." "Great," Peter exclaimed, hopping into his seat and holding up a packet. "This is where I thought we should start. Chem. I'd imagine you're pretty good at it, right? I am too. But I want to get faster at balancing equations until it's like second nature to me. I know. How about we race to see who can balance them the fastest? My mind works like a computer. It is impossible for you to balance them faster than me." Challenge accepted. Al plus sodium hydroxide plus H2O. Nol, O, 4 plus H2, go. He plowed through the pages of equations in less than an hour, and Peter found it was actually fun with Vision working with him. Even writing the essay was somewhat enjoyable, especially since Vision could access the internet in his head, and he agreed to proofread the paper afterwards to fix any grammatical errors. On the couch across the room, Tony heard Peter giggling, and he turned to see he and Vision seated at the table, the kid armed with a calculator and the android a pen. They were on algebra now, and Peter was fending no better on those equations against Vision's computer mind than the last, even when he required him to write all his work down. Spider-Man frantically pounded at the buttons on his calculator while Vision scribbled numbers down on a page, until finally the android announced that he was finished. Peter dropped his calculator in defeat, laughing helplessly, and Vision chuckled. Tony watched the two of them in disbelief, wondering how Peter had actually managed to get Vision to laugh, something he didn't even know was possible. Then he turned away with a smile. "Kid's got a gift, I'll give him that much." Outside, the downpour continued to fall in a relentless wave, pounding against the window as the 4 superheroes talked, worked, and studied. To Peter, it was one of the most amazing days of his life. According to the rest of the cold, busy city, it was just another rainy day. The broken-winged bird. Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly. The wind was brisk and refreshing as it rushed past his body and whistled in his ears. Golden light from the sinking sun gilded the cityscape that surrounded him, making all the towering buildings glisten like new pennies. Far beneath his feet, cars and people hurried about like bustling ants, but up here, the world was spacious and free. Inhaling the crisp air into his lungs, He somersaulted through the endless sky, then pressed his fingers to his palm. I assume Langston Hughes was referring to aspirations when he was talking about dreams in that poem. Just the other night, I had a dream that I was bitten by a radioactive chipmunk instead of a spider and gained the ability to stuff 8 slices of pizza in my cheeks. I think I could get away with letting that image die without my life breaking its wings and sucking or whatever. Peter Parker dropped low on a thread of webbing, then flung himself high above the street, grinning with delight. No matter how often he found himself up here, web swinging across the sparkling landscape of New York City never ceased to thrill him beyond compare. All his trivial problems with school and friends seemed to vanish, and there was nothing but himself and the open sky. It was an entirely different reality where he could simply enjoy being who he was, being Spider-Man. The world below blurred together as he pressed forward, and the flip-floppy feeling that spun in his stomach made him giggle. Well, for my non-chipmunky dreams, I'll pass on the bird metaphor, Mr. Hughes. Mainly because my new situation has resulted in me having to kill some old dreams in order to pursue new ones. Better, more significant ones, I hope. A line of webbing snagged onto the bottom of a sign extended over the street, and he whipped all the way around it before landing on top. The familiar sounds of the city buzzed from every direction as he gazed across the urban jungle with a smile. I wonder if there are any cutesy rhymes or cheesy quotes out there that could directly apply to my situation. At that moment, a flock of birds was stirred from their perch above him and took off in a flutter wings. A splat of white liquid dropped onto his shoulder just before they flew out of range, making him start then groan. Seriously, that's how we're playing this? What kind of metaphor is this, Langston? He smeared it with the back of his hand, then glared up at the black dots vanishing into the sky, waving his fist. I hope all your dreams and wings break, you flying rats. The mangy pigeons didn't offer a reply. He leaned off the flashing sign sourly. I suppose my day was going a bit too good. That charming Parker luck had to nab its regular drop on me, one way or another. With a sigh, he whipped his lunch bag off his shoulder and shoved his hand inside. His fingers bumped something smooth, and he pulled a shiny red apple out with a grin. Of course, nothing like a homemade meal to get your spirits back up. And this view isn't getting old anytime soon. Gazing across the jagged, sparkling city, Peter lifted his mask away from his mouth and took a big bite from the fruit, swinging his feet through the open air as they dangled off the edge of the sign. It sure was a beautiful afternoon, and one couldn't have found a more peaceful spot for a lunch break. Of course, being Spider-Man, the serenity couldn't last. A sudden tingle crawled up the back of his neck, followed by a sense of alarm. Before he had even registered that it was his spidey sense buzzing inside his head, a large object came hurtling over the tower in front of him. He could hear gears grinding, an engine whirring, and a person screaming. Whatever it was zipped right over his head and crashed on top of the roof directly behind him, making Peter duck with a start and accidentally drop his sack lunch. Spider-Man fell back against the building, yelping in surprise, wondering what the hell had just happened, then frantically scrambled forward and fired a line of webbing after his food. The thread snagged onto the falling bag. Great, except it attached to the bottom, and Peter could only watch as the webbing grew taut and the bag whipped upside down, dumping all of his lunch onto the sidewalk far below. The empty sack swayed tauntingly in the wind. He knew there was nothing salvageable, and his shoulders sank miserably. Peter looked up at the roof where the unidentified flying object had landed, detached the web line from his wrist, then carefully climbed along the glass to peek over the edge. Hey, whoever's responsible for whatever the hell just happened owes me a new, he began to yell, yanking his mask back over his face. But when his eyes fell upon the crumpled form sprawled across the rooftop, his words caught in his throat. The fallen object was bulky and motionless. It was a person, he realized, a man, but not just a man. He was wearing a very unique outfit, a padded, gray leather costume with red detailing, high-tech gloves, and a thick utility belt strung around his waist, outfitted with a wide variety of weapons. It reminded him of military gear, although a bit more eccentric. But above all else, Peter's gaze was drawn to the strange contraption attached to his back. Smoke was swirling from the center of the pack, and 2 long, metal extensions protruded out at either side. They were wings. Giant, mechanical wings. When it finally dawned on him who it was, Peter gasped. "Oh my God," he whispered, skittering all the way onto the roof and dropping into a tentative crouch. It's you? Holy shit. You? We're in Germany. Flying angry bird guy, with that metal-armed dude. We fought." The man made no movement or response. It looked like his flight pack was damaged and he was flecked with cuts and scrapes. Either he was knocked out cold, or conked out for good. Spider-Man gingerly inched closer to him, straining to see his face, then pulled back quickly, keeping low to the rooftop. "You need to call Mr. Stark." That was the first thought to come to his head. What the hell was this guy doing in New York City? The police, global task forces, and a bunch of other freaky government agencies were on the hunt for him. He was in league with Captain America, who had busted him out of prison along with the rest of his team. He was an escaped convict. A criminal who needed to be brought to justice. It would be right for Spider-Man to turn him in. And yet, in that moment, Peter found himself conflicted. This man had been an Avenger before turning against the law, right? A few years back, he had helped Cap save the world from those Hydra ships in Washington, D.C. Clearly he was a good person at some point or another. What had changed? Peter still didn't feel like he fully understood what both sides of the fight were about. Was it really all because they wanted to keep that assassin guy, the Winter Soldier, from going to jail? Or could it be something to do with those Sokovia Accord papers he kept hearing about? Were they bad in some way? Enough to make Captain America abandon everything he once stood for? It didn't add up? Before he could sort through his muddled thoughts, Peter was startled by a low moan. He turned to find that the man was moving, slowly, groggily, feebly. Unsure how he would react, Spider-Man skirted along the edge of the roof until he was standing parallel to his head from a safe distance away. He could see now that he was struggling to come to. Behind his broken goggles, his eyes were squeezed shut in pain. Geez. Wah. The winged man moaned, reaching up to rub at his forehead. A deep gash above his eyebrow was spilling blood down his face. Where? It quickly became clear, and much to his relief, that this guy wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. On the contrary, it also became clear that he was badly hurt. Wars and politics aside, he needed help. Peter wanted to hope that if someone from Cap's side found someone from Iron Man's squad in the same defenseless position, IR past grudges and lend them a hand. One superhero to another, right? Emphasis on hope. This is a horrible idea, he warned himself. Then again, the ones he considered his best usually were. I'm most definitely going to regret this. Nevertheless, swallowing the lump in his throat, Spider-Man carefully inched towards the fallen Avenger, staying low and wary. As the dude griped and grumbled weakly, Peter gave a nervous cough. Hello? Mr. Birdman, sir? Are you okay? Blinking sluggishly, the man slowly turned towards the strange voice. His head was throbbing and his vision was fuzzy, but he managed to make out a blurry red and blue figure from the haze. It took him a good minute to distinguish the circle with the two smaller white circles as a masked face, and the black blob in the center of the mess as an image of Spider. He studied him with a mixture of confusion and fatigue, still lying flat against the roof, then gradually narrowed his eyes. "The hell?" he murmured. "You?" After another couple seconds, he began to try to lift himself off the concrete. I'm not sure that's a good idea. You look pretty banged up." Completely ignoring his advice, the man clambered to his hands and knees, spitting curses like a sailor the whole time, then carefully rolled over and flopped against the partially elevated corner of the roof, letting his arms and wings fall messily at his sides. He laid there limply, closing his eyes and fighting to catch his breath. His left hand was gripped around his torso. "Where am I?" Frowning, Peter shot a look over his shoulder. New York. Brooklyn, no Queens. Damn it. Spider-Man studied him curiously as he fumbled with his gauntlets. He pressed at a button on his glove repeatedly, trying to make the engine restart, but nothing happened. When he couldn't get that to work, he clicked on the trigger that was supposed to make his wings fold back into the pack, but that was busted as well. Scowling in defeat, he tore the cracked goggles from his eyes and flung them to the ground, dropping his head against the wall with a scoff. "So, what happened to you?" Without replying, he unclipped the strap wrapped around his chest to relieve the broken flight gear from his shoulders. His other hand remained firmly glued to his side. "What's your name again? You were in Germany with Captain America, right? I was there too. We sorta attacked each other. You tried to blow me up and I webbed you and emo assassin man to the floor." He cocked his head to the side. "Do you remember? Or did you hit your head too hard to remember? You were falling super fast from the sky. Are you badly hurt? If you want, I could call." In an instant, the man snagged a gun from the holster on his hip and had it aimed at Peter's face. Spider-Man jumped back reflexively, raising his hands into the air. "Don't call anyone," he practically spat, the weapon wobbling a little in his fingers. His breathing was ragged and shaky, but his cold glare made it clear he wasn't joking around. Swallowing uneasily, Spider-Man nodded with his arms still held above his head. "Oh, okay, got it. No phone calls. Knowing my shitty provider, I probably wouldn't get any reception up here anyway." His eyes wandered back to the right side of the man's torso, which was still being gripped by his left hand. He noticed his glove was stained red and a dark puddle was beginning to form underneath him. "But you are hurt. Your side's bleeding pretty bad, isn't it? I'm no doctor, but that looks serious to me, so maybe I could." "Just go away," he snapped bitterly. "If you want to help, then take your stupid ass someplace else and don't tell nobody you saw me here." Ouch, Peter thought, withering a little. He couldn't deny how much the words stung to hear, especially coming from someone he had admired in the past. Although, could he really blame the guy? Their only interaction had been from opposite sides of a fight, and he had probably been on the run ever since he'd escaped. Now he was lying injured and incapacitated beneath a supposed enemy who could blow his cover and have him thrown in a prison cell with the touch of a button. How could he expect this man to trust him, especially when he most definitely did not trust him back? But he couldn't just leave him here. What if he really was dangerous? And there was also the issue of him bleeding to death. Inhaling carefully, Peter decided to keep pressing. "Look, I'm sorry, but I can't just, I'm sort of a protector of this area. See, I gotta keep it safe. And after everything that's happened, I'm not so sure you're a good guy anymore." He crouched a little lower. "But I am sure I don't want you to die." He huffed with spite, trying to sit upright but quickly opting against it. "You must really think I'm an idiot if you believe I'd fall for that charade. You're nothing but Stark's freaky little attack dog. Doing everything he says, kissing his ass left and right. You probably don't even know what you're endorsing or why I'm risking my life for my stance in all this." He laid a hand over his face and sighed defeatedly. "But, hell, why should I even bother? I'm sure by this point you've already called up Daddy to fly me back to the raft." Spider-Man's sympathy for the injured man was rapidly shifting to irritation. Partially because he was throwing wild accusations in his face when he was only trying to help him, and partially because he was right. Peter knew he didn't understand all of this, what each side had really clashed over, or why, and he was sick of being kept in the dark. How about instead of reminding him of what he didn't understand, somebody just explain it to him? He needed answers, and he needed to keep this jerk from dying, but he also needed to approach this the right way. Unfortunately, acting and speaking before thinking was one of his fatal flaws. Frowning crossly, Spider-Man responded with an edge to his voice. "No, I haven't called him yet. I haven't called anyone yet. And I wasn't planning to, although you're really tempting me otherwise. I'm clearly not the only one dealing with misunderstanding here. Why do you think I haven't webbed you up like last time or called the police? I want to help you and maybe hear your side of the story, if you'd stop being such a butthead about it." He crossed his arms against his chest and tilted his chin up, trying to look confident. "So, unless you let me help you, I am going to call someone. An ambulance. Because I have a strict policy against letting anyone die on my watch, and I'm not about to break my streak. So, that's that. Spidey or ambulance? You decide. Sir." The man's expression had jumped from angry to confused to now a bit surprised. His gaze traced him up and down and his eyebrows wrinkled together. Eventually, a look of amusement flashed across his face. After a moment in thought, he scoffed. "Who even are you?" Peter was not expecting the question. "Me? Well, I'm just, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man." "Spider-Man? I fight crime and stuff. Did Tony pick that name for you?" "No, I did. I was Spider-Man before I met Mr. Stark." "Really? I mean, it didn't take much thought. I am indeed a man with spider powers. and Black Widow was already taken. To Peter's shock, after studying him a second longer, the man chuckled lightly. That is a shame. Stirred with a bit more bravery, Spider-Man swallowed and knelt down to his eye level. What's your name? He eyed him with an almost insulted look on his face. You don't know who I am? I mean, yeah, I know who you are. I just don't remember your name. Do you even have a superhero name? Bird Dude, Wingman, Flappy McFlapface. Falcon, he said with a snort. It's Falcon. Peter slapped his forehead. Oh, right, duh, Falcon. Okay, I remember now. I think I bought one of those packs of tiny microwavable mac and cheeses with your face on the little cups back when you were, well, before everything went to hell. Falcon shook his head in disbelief. Holy sussed a kid, aren't you? He shrunk back and scratched his head. No, I'm 36 and a half. Nice try. Whatever. So'd I just call you Falcon? Not the Falcon or Mr. Falcon or the Millennium Falcon? Let's stick with Sam. Alright? Spider-Man sat down against the rooftop. Sam? Yeah. I mean, I'm not like you. My name's already out there. I got a Wikipedia page and all that. Ah, okay. Coolio. Sam. Sam coughed harshly into his hand, then wiped his arm over his forehead, smearing the blood still dripping from the cut on his eyebrow. How do you even get pulled into all this mess? Glancing down at his side again, Peter bit the inside of his cheek. Well, how about I tell you while I look at your injuries, and then maybe you can tell me what you and Cap and all the other dudes on your side are really fighting for. Sam raised an eyebrow. I can take care of myself, thanks. I know. I can too. But you're bleeding really badly, and going to get help from someone who hasn't crash-landed head first into a building whether you like it or not. That's either me or an EMT. You decide. He knew he was being short, especially considering who he was talking to, but he couldn't help himself. The man's wound held a startling resemblance to another bloody casualty that had taken the life of someone he cared about. He refused to allow another person's death to stem from his inaction, regardless of the man's protests. Closing his eyes, Sam chuckled irritably. You're such a little asshole. Peter giggled. Sorry. What are you even going to do? I dropped my medkit, like, 40 clicks from here. Spider-Man hunched his shoulders. Well, let's see. He made his way across the rooftop to crouch at Falcon's side, moving carefully. I've had to cope with my fair share of embarrassing spills from the sky, especially when I first started out. I think I've landed in that giant dumpster beside Domino's about 6 times now. He could tell that the man was still wary of him. His right hand was draped over the gun lying against the concrete, and his left was still gripped firmly around his side. But, realizing he didn't have much choice except to humor the oddly dressed superhero, he dropped his head back with a sigh and slowly peeled his fingers off his wound. If you try anything, I'll blow your damn head off. Peter cringed. Alrighty. Duly noted. Leaning low to the roof to get a better look at the injury, he kept his movements slow and calculated. It quickly came to his attention that the man's gauntlet and side were saturated with blood, and the red puddle underneath his body was growing wider by the second. His heart fluttered with alarm. What exactly happened to you? He asked, pulling the torn fabric away from his skin. He could see the wound clearly now, a jagged, messy gash, stretching about 2 inches in length. It looked like a chunk of flesh had been punched out of his body by a cookie cutter. Aerial assault, he replied weakly. Some government attack dogs just appeared out of nowhere and started pounding me with lead. Or maybe they weren't government. Hell, I don't know. It was an ambush. I lost them in a storm about 30 miles west, but by then the damage was done. I basically coasted until my pack finally gave out, and that's how I got here. Peter tore the surrounding leather away with one quick yank, making Sam flinch and groan. He didn't think the injury was deep enough for anything important to be damaged, but it was still bleeding profusely. Why were you coming to New York? He snorted. Wasn't planning on it. Just kinda happened. I barely remember half of what went down while I was up there. His whole body was plastered with scratches, but the bullet wound was definitely what needed his attention the most, although he wasn't sure exactly what he should do about it. It definitely required more than what he was capable of. I think you might need stitches, Peter thought out loud, feeling himself begin to sweat. He hadn't had to deal with gore like this yet. He didn't know how to deal with it. He knew being a masked vigilante who fought bad guys and protected people might lead to him having to face it sooner or later, but now that it was happening, he didn't know what to do. This man really needed his help. His life potentially depended on it, and he was freezing up. Why had he thought he could fix this? The scarlet pool was thickening rapidly. Probably, like I was saying, Sam murmured, trying to keep his breath steady. But I don't have time for that. Either figure something else out, or get out of here. By now I'm sure the assholes who attacked me have narrowed in on my crash point. Peter could tell he was playing this tough. He wondered how painful being shot was. He had no desire to know anytime soon. Growing desperate, he glanced around the rooftop, scanning for anything he could use to stop the bleeding. Maybe he could ask somebody in the building for help? Or maybe borrow some supplies? Or even steal some? At this point, he wasn't above the idea. Or, hell, maybe he really should just call an ambulance. He'd rather have the guy hate him than let him die. Peter's breathing grew shallow with fear, and he scratched at his wrists. Why did Mr. Stark have to make these web shooters so damn itchy? Wait. Web shooters? He glanced down to his hands, lifting the devices closer to his face. The web fluid he'd manufactured. It was stretchy, adhesive, and tensile. It could fill in holes and patch up leaks. It was like liquid bandaging. That could work, right? Temporarily, at least. He had never thought to use it in that way before. It was worth a shot. Glancing back to Sam, Peter swallowed. Okay, so, I've sorta got an idea. Just try to stay still, okay? Sam frowned. What are you gonna do? Without answering, Peter carefully aimed his wrist at Falcon's side and folded his fingers to his palm. A glob of webbing shot from the device and splattered over the wound, making Sam leap and cry with agony. Gah! What the hell? What do you sorry, Spider-Man apologized timidly. He thickened the coating and outer edges with a couple more layers of webbing despite Sam's groans and curses. You're freaking me out and rushing me. I think that should keep it closed and stop the bleeding for now. Is this? He gawked in horror, straining to look at his injury. From your body? Peter giggled. No, I can't make webbing like a real spider. That'd be nasty. This is a special web fluid concoction I spliced together and installed into a pair of shooting devices. See? Spider-Man held his wrists out proudly for Falcon to see, but he was too busy moaning in pain to care. Why you're, the strangest person I've ever met. And I've met a super soldier with a metal arm from the 1940s. Peter watched as he gingerly dragged himself to a sitting position, holding his side with an agonized expression, and grimaced a little. You mean, the Winter Soldier? Licking his dry lips, Sam lifted his gaze and eyed him suspiciously. Peter could tell he had struck a nerve, and wondered what he should say next. But after a short pause, he sighed. He's not who you think he is. Yeah, he's crazy, and terrifying, and a major pain in my ass, but half the time it isn't his fault. He's a good man who's been forced to do bad stuff. Mind control and a bunch of other freaky shit I don't understand. He dabbed at the cut along his eyebrow hesitantly. And look, I can't really vouch for the guy. I barely know him. And for the majority of the time I was around him, he was trying to kill me. But Cap really cares about him, and I'm Cap's friend. So I trust him enough to back him in all this. Even if that means breaking the law and putting people in danger? Spider-Man retorted cautiously. Sam snorted in response. Excuse me, you want to talk about breaking the law? What do you think you're doing? Throwing on a ridiculous costume and a mask and taking up vigilantism? Peter blinked perplexedly. What? Yeah. I wasn't sure but now I am. I talked with a journalist a while ago who knew about you. She told me how some new guy in mask who climbed walls and fought criminals was swinging around New York. He nodded towards him. That's you, right? Crouching down on his haunches, Spider-Man narrowed his eyes. Well, yeah, like I said before. He brightened. That's pretty cool, actually. Did she write an article about me? Start a blog? Maybe? A Spidey-themed Pinterest page? That'd be awesome. Then he shook his head. But, anyway, I think what I'm doing is a little different than what you're doing. Really? You think you're better than us? You're taking the law into your own hands? You get in the way of the authorities and try to do their job for them when you're just a kid with no knowledge of the situations you're invoking your will in. Peter pouted. But I help people. I use my powers to stop bad guys and protect people. It's the right thing to do. I know it is. I save lives. And why the hell do you think Cap and I have broken the law and put ourselves in danger? Sam shot back. The only reason we've gone against the system is because we want to continue protecting people from the real bad guys who are trying to hurt them. If you think we're criminals for doing that, then you'd better be willing to call yourself one, too. Chuckling scornfully, Sam laid a hand over his face. Jesus, kid. Did Tony even tell you what you were fighting for when he dragged you to Germany? What the Sokovia Accords actually say? Peter's face reddened a little under his mask. He rubbed at the back of his neck sheepishly. Well, not entirely. They prevent the Avengers from helping people. Instead of letting us go to the places that need our help, some back-minded government panel would have total control over us. Where we are, what we do, and when we can do it. There could be an army of aliens blasting a crater in New Guinea, killing thousands of innocent people, and we'd have to wait on a bunch of crotchety old men to give us the green light, if they're even willing. Sam shook his head sadly. We didn't agree with that. We couldn't, not after all that's happened and everything we've been through. We all knew we had to fight to protect the world the way it needs us to protect it, even if that meant going against the government or the UN or even our friends. We had to do what we believed was the right thing to do. Exhaling dejectedly, Sam lifted his gaze to stare at Spider-Man, his expression cold. And from what you've told me, I would think that'd be something you'd agree with. The young teen seated in front of him looked taken back, even with his mask hiding his face. Peter held Sam's stony gaze for a second longer, knowing well he was speaking sincerely, then turned away to stare at the concrete, eyes wide. Whoa! Is that true? I knew the Accords had something to do with the Avengers and how they operated, but I wasn't sure. It was alarming news to hear. But even worse, he realized that Falcon was right. He most definitely did not like the idea, at least, not the version that Sam was describing to him. Superheroes being controlled, restricted, and ordered around? Only being able to help people whenever they were told to? If that's what the Sokovia Accords were proposing, then he didn't agree with them. The more he thought about, the more clear that became. He didn't agree with them at all. How could he? Everything he had done and was doing ran totally opposite of that ideology. Spider-Man swung around the city stopping bad guys and helping people on his own terms with his own morality guiding him. He stepped in to save people wherever and whenever he could, because he understood firsthand how terrible the consequences of non-intervention could be. Would he like it if it suddenly became someone else's job to decide when and where he helped? If some out-of-touch politician with their own set of priorities was in charge of everything he did as a hero? If he had to ask permission to save a helpless citizen every time one was being mugged right before his very eyes? Absolutely not. How would that even work? He wasn't an Avenger, at least, he didn't think so. Not yet, anyway, but he assumed that if the Avengers were being regulated, the Accords would eventually stretch out to affect heroes like him, too, especially after his involvement in Germany. Would he have to carry some special sneaky government phone? Would they chip him like a dog to track his whereabouts 24/7? How would he keep all this a secret from Aunt May? Oh God. He'd have to tell them his identity, wouldn't he? There was no way he'd be able to remain anonymous if the government was in control of him. Was this really the reality that he had been fighting for with Mr. Stark and Colonel Rhodes and all the others? Then it hit him like a punch in the gut, Mr. Stark. He had come to his home, he had spoken with him and his aunt. He had listened to everything Peter had said about why he was doing this and what he believed in. And yet, after all that, he had still recruited him to battle for the imposition of the Sokovia Accords. He had brought him along to fight for something that he obviously didn't even support. When you can do the things I can, but you don't, and then the bad things happen, they happen because of you. That was what he had told him, that was what he believed. And that was completely against what the Sokovia Accords stood for. Mr. Stark had to have known that, didn't he? Then why did he still enlist him for his side? Had he actually just used him, tricked him by not explaining what he was truly fighting for, just so he could use Spider-Man's abilities to better his chances of beating Cap's team? Agent Romanov had warned him earlier that that might have been the case, but he hadn't wanted to believe it. He certainly didn't want to believe it now. Especially considering that Mr. Stark knew who he was, where he lived, his family. If he really did support the Sokovia Accords, and he was being told what to do by the government, what if he was ordered to reveal Spider-Man's secret identity to them? With one word, Mr. Stark could destroy Peter Parker's life and put everyone he cared about in danger. Peter suddenly felt sick to his stomach. His mouth had gone dry. "Take it how you will, kid," Sam said, snapping Spider-Man from his thoughts, "but I think you've got this all backwards. Maybe you ought to look at things a little more carefully before plopping your ass on the wrong side of a war." Peter's eyes remained locked on the concrete. "So, is that what you guys are still trying to do? Protect the world, stop bad guys and all that, even though the government is hunting you?" Noticing the change in the young hero's tone, a solemn smile pulled at Sam's lips. He stretched his arms gingerly above his head. "Yeah, guess that's one way to put it. If this guy and Cap and that growing dude are criminals, then I'm a criminal too." It had never occurred to Peter that what he was doing as Spider-Man was technically illegal, which meant he was being a total hypocrite in this situation. Maybe it was because he'd never really had any bad run-ins with cops yet. Certainly none that had resulted in a chunk of his side being blown off. Gag. "Speaking of being hunted," Sam continued, "I really need to get out of here. Those men could show up any second to blast the rest of me to bits." Gritting his teeth, he slowly crawled towards his flight suit. "What?" Peter exclaimed, rising to his feet. "Where are you going?" "I don't know, away from here, with your wings? Damn things are busted. I'll have to walk or something." He wrestled with the metal extensions, trying to get them to fold. Spider-Man didn't know how to feel at this point. He didn't know who he could trust anymore. Tony Stark was so freaking cool, and had done some really nice things for him, but now he wasn't sure if they were for the right reasons. Meanwhile, this guy and his crew had been spreading fear and mayhem across the entire world over the last couple months. Be protecting it. Which was the right path to take. As he watched Sam struggle to move his injured body and adjust his broken wings, Peter decided that it didn't matter, at least not right this moment. Sam was doing what he believed was right, and he could only hope that Mr. Stark was doing the same. For now, he was going to do what he believed was the right thing to do for the current predicament he was faced with. Inhaling resolutely, Spider-Man strode across the roof and stopped in front of the pack, dropping into a crouch by his side. Sam flinched. "Well, that won't do," Peter replied. What's the Falcon without his kick-ass flight suit? Nothing but a sad, angry man whose flightless face will never be featured on a microwavable mac and cheese cup ever again, that's what." Sam blinked, then snorted. "Gee, thanks, I can't have that. Those mac and cheeses are my midnight munchies staple." Beneath his mask, Peter smiled shyly, and, you seem like a pretty cool dude. I wish I got to hang out with Captain America all day and be a bird-themed badass." He chuckled, then sobered up a little. "Plus, if what you said before is what you're really fighting for, then I want to make sure you get to keep doing it. I honestly didn't know why you all were breaking the law and getting into so much trouble, but I'm glad you told me. It does sound like you're supporting something good, even if Mr. Stark and everyone else don't see it that way. And you're right. I should have looked into everything more before joining the fight. Sorry about that." Sam studied him quietly before breaking into a smile. "Huh. Well, it's cool. You may be obnoxious as all hell, and, like, a fourth grader, but you probably have more sense about you than half the Avengers right now. Maybe you should try talking some of that sense through Tony's thick skull." Peter was terrified to even bring up the subject around him by now, but gave a small nod regardless. He was glad the two of them had managed to reach some kind of peace, despite the grudges still held by the sides they had supported. He looked up at Sam expectantly. "So, may I?" he asked, prodding at the metal gear with his finger. "May you what? Take a look at your wings. I might be able to fix them." "You, yeah, me," Falcon scoffed. "You a military mechanic now, too?" "Well, no," Peter said, popping open a flat panel that revealed the inner workings of the flight pack, "but, I know a thing or two about building stuff and electrical circuiting and all that. I can at least try." Sam watched the boy as he fiddled with the wires and engine delicately, wondering where on earth Tony had found this guy. He had crazy powers, an innocent kindness about him, and an incredibly smart and solid head on his shoulders, despite his obviously young age. The kid was an enigma. "Damn, you've sure got a lot going for ya," he giggled shyly. "More like I'm a dork who needs to find a more social way to spend my free time. But don't go complimenting me yet." He reached far into the pack and found something lodged inside the metal. With a yank, he ripped it free and held it up to his face. A bullet. Probably the one that had caused all the damage. If the titanium hadn't stopped it, it would have blown a much more deadly hole through Sam's body. He studied it curiously, wondering why the people who were after him were so quick to jump to lethal force, then tossed it over his shoulder, getting back to business. "Let's see," he mumbled as he worked. Two exposed wires that had been snapped in half were touching, creating sparks that were burning the rubbery insulation surrounding them. That's what was causing all the smoke, which meant the repairs required were a lot less complicated than he had anticipated. All he had to do was link the correct wires back together. Moving carefully, he held the two sides of one frayed line against each other, then made them stick with a small shot of webbing. Satisfied, he did the same with the second wire, and laid them both back in their correct places. It was possible that the bullet had shredded through something else in the pack, but he hoped whatever it was wasn't too important. Thankfully, the engine itself didn't appear to be damaged, and he closed the panel back up. "Alrighty," Peter huffed. "Try starting it up again." Skeptically, Sam lifted the flight pack off the roof and carefully slipped it back onto his shoulders, clipping the belt around his torso. He clicked the activation button on his glove, and with a couple of chugs and sputters, the engine slowly hummed to life. Sam stood and laughed in shock. "No freakin' way," he cried, lifting off the roof then whipping into a triumphant spin. You actually did it." "It was honestly nothing," Peter insisted, "just enough to get you to a real mechanic and a real doctor. The web fluid I used to stick everything back together probably won't last more than a couple hours, so I get going pretty quick if I were you." He tilted his head to the side. "Do you have somewhere to go to get patched up?" Landing back against the roof and retracting the wings into his pack, Sam stared down at the kid with a mixture of confusion and amusement. He was short, a lot shorter than he remembered. He hadn't been able to see Spider-Man's height in contrast to his own until now, when they were standing directly in front of each other. It was almost sad to think that someone so young and with so much potential was all tangled up in their disagreements and mistakes, which he had no control over. His mindset was so simple, yet so pure. Do what you believe is the right thing to do. He could only dream that the world could operate on such simple terms without everyone ending up at each other's throats. Shaking his head, Sam sighed. Yeah, I think so." He turned to face the edge of the rooftop, pressing his hand to his side. "And I really appreciate all this. If I had run into anyone else from Iron Man's team, I'd be back in a cell for sure." Spider-Man walked to stand by his side, crossing his arms against his chest. "Well, please don't make me regret it. You seem pretty awesome and all, and I'm still repressing the urge to ask you to, sign my forehead or something, but I'm not 100% certain that what you're doing is right." He threw his hands up defensively, and, hey, let's be clear, I don't know if what I'm doing is the right way to go about this either. His gaze fell to his feet. "But either way, I really hope you and me and all the other super people are still united by our mutual goal to save the world or whatever, and that maybe someday you guys can all work together and put your differences aside to help people as a big, badass team again." He waited, thinking Sam would surely laugh at his juvenile wistfulness. Instead, Sam smiled softly. "That'd sure be nice, kid. Hold on to that dream for me, would ya?" Spider-Man looked up at him in surprise, hands falling to his sides. Sam returned his grin, seeming to understand their quiet camaraderie, then locked his gaze on the horizon. With a sharp breath, Falcon shifted forwards, shuffling his feet closer to the edge, when he suddenly slipped. Peter jerked out and caught him in an instant, narrowly stopping him from tumbling off the building. "Whoa," he stammered, supporting him with an arm under his shoulders. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, hey," Sam chuckled, gripping his head in his hand. "Woo, man. Sorry about that. I guess I'm still a little out of it. I'm fine." "Are you sure? I mean, it'd be kinda awkward, but I could try, web swinging you to safety, or—" Nah, you've done enough," he assured him, relieving his weight from Spider-Man's shoulders. You don't need to be seen helping the likes of me anyhow. You're in this deep enough as is. I'll be fine." He backed away from the edge a little, kneading sorely at his temple. Spider-Man watched him nervously, hoping he was actually planning to go to a doctor and not just saying so to get him off his case. He was really beaten up. "Hey Sam," he said as Falco. "Yeah?" he replied. Spider-Man fidgeted his hands timidly. "Could you maybe, after you're all fixed up and whatnot, say hi to Cap for me? And tell him that he's awesome? I mean, that I think he's awesome? I mean, he is awesome, obviously, but I just want him to know that it's me who is reminding him of the fact that he is indeed awesome. If I see him, I'll let him know." Sam chuckled. He grinned brightly. "Thanks. Oh, and also that, I'm sorry for fighting you all without really knowing the whole story." Sam nodded. "All right. Yay." Balling his hands into fists, Falcon broke into a sprint across the rooftop. With a click of his thumb, the massive metal wings unfurled from the pack and extended out at his sides right as he leapt off the edge. For an instant, he free fell, and Peter wondered in a panic if he had actually fixed his gear or not. But to his relief, Sam quickly caught the breeze and zipped into the air, spinning with all the grace and effortlessness of a real falcon. He was headed towards the clouds, clearly to avoid any further detection. Spider-Man hoped he had made the right decision in helping him. By now, that was all he could do. At the very least, he hoped Sam would be all right. He seemed like someone who really wanted to help the world, and who was willing to put himself in danger's way to do so. That was everything that Spider-Man hoped to be and more. As Peter watched him soar, a little starstruck and fangirly, something suddenly dawned on him. Frowning, he glared up at the twirling Avenger as he ascended towards the heavens, cupping his hands around his mouth. "Hey Falcon, one last thing." Sam glanced over his shoulder, having to yell over the wind to be heard. "What?" Spider-Man raised his fist into the air and waved it angrily as Falcon vanished into the clouds. "You still freakin' owe me a new lunch. Unlock the door." "Hello, Earth to Peter Parker. What's the matter with you?" It wasn't until he felt a hand jab his arm that Peter finally snapped back to reality, blinking his eyes. "Huh? What?" "Dude, did you even hear me? I asked you a question. You've been staring at your mashed potatoes like a zombie for the past 5 minutes." The bubbly chatter of the high school cafeteria slowly washed back over him. The lull of conversation, the sound of chewing and footsteps, and the ticking of the clock on the wall on the other side of the room. He glanced across the lunch table to see a couple of girls walk by, snickering into their hands. Peter sat up straight, feeling his face grow warm. Sorry. He turned to his left. What was the question?" Ned snorted. "The algebra quiz, bro. Was it hell?" Yawning and rubbing his hands into his eyes, Peter shook his head. "Oh. That. No, it was fine. Just a front and back page about inverse trig functions. Took me 3 minutes. He scooped a blob of mushy potatoes onto his spoon and popped it into his mouth, realizing he had yet to take a single bite of his lunch. Ned moaned. "You know your version of fine is a little different than mine, Pete. I got a B on the last 2, so I seriously gotta do well on the next ones to keep my A for the semester." He hunched his shoulders bitterly. This wouldn't be an issue if somebody hadn't skipped out on our study group last night, again. He could feel Ned's irritated glare drilling into his skull, and he swallowed painfully, guilt itching at the back of his throat. "Why yeah, I know. I'm real sorry, Ned. I dunno how it slipped my mind. I've just been busy. Super busy. With stuff. And by stuff I mean jumping off of skyscrapers in red and blue spandex, webbing up baddies, and saving cats from garbage chutes. Now that sure was an eventful evening." "What the hell is keeping you so busy?" he asked, digging into his hamburger. "You've missed, 3 different classes this week and skipped the decathlon meeting again. Did you get a job?" Peter felt a finger poke him in the ribs. "Don't tell me it's a girl. You aren't ditching for some chick, are you? I mean, I know the dance is coming up, and getting any kind of action for either of us is a miracle, but still." "No, it's not a girl," Peter laughed shyly. He scoured his mind for an excuse that he hadn't already cited a million times before. "I've just been sick, allergies. That's all." He coughed into his arm for effect. He really wasn't in the mood to talk about this right now. Far more pressing matters were on his mind. "Well, speaking of the dance," Ned said with a mischievous grin, "have you muscled up the courage to ask you-know-who yet?" Before he could reply, the bell tolled overhead, coming in serious clutch for once. He stood quickly and joined the massive exodus, leaving Ned lagging far behind. Hey, Peter. Where are you going? Wait up. I'll catch you later. Ned, Peter called back to him, throwing a half-hearted wave over his shoulder. He was across the lunchroom and around the corner before the bell chime had ended. Peter Parker hadn't slept very well the past couple of nights. He couldn't stop thinking about what Sam had told him. Contrary to his initial presumptions, the Sokovia Accords were no bueno for a certain spandex-sporting spider kid who enjoyed operating as a masked vigilante, secret identity intact. The UN papers got the government all involved in the Avengers' superheroing antics, and that was not something he really agreed with, nor something he wanted to have encroaching on his own life anytime soon. Also, Captain America and his crew weren't exactly the mindless radicals everyone believed them to be. They were trying to do the right thing and keep the world safe. And, worst of all, there was Mr. Stark. Mr. Stark was awesome. He was a genius, an icon, the invincible Iron Man. On top of all that, he had taken Peter under his wing, upgraded his tech, and given him the coolest freaking costume in the world. But now, it also seemed like Mr. Stark had kind of used him. He hadn't taken time to explain everything to Peter before dragging him into a war to fight for something he didn't necessarily support. It was really scary to think about. He wasn't sure he could trust him anymore, and the fact that Mr. Stark could expose Peter Parker as Spider-Man at any given moment, whether the Accords required it or simply if the right mood hit, wasn't exactly a comfort. As he jogged out of the school, stripped off his cover clothes behind an alley, and leapt into the air with an overstuffed backpack hanging off his shoulder and a mask covering his face, threads of webbing carrying him down the road, he realized he couldn't take it anymore. He had to talk to Mr. Stark about this. If he didn't, the worry and paranoia were going to eat him alive. He hoped the billionaire Avenger wouldn't mind him popping by the tower for a quick chat. He had never really visited the facility without Mr. Stark being the one who took him there. He also hoped that he was completely wrong about everything that was currently gnawing at his nerves. Within minutes, he had whipped his way across New York all the way to Avengers Tower. He swung from a web line and stuck to the sheer surface, squinting his eyes to see through the tinted windows. It didn't look like anybody was home, at least, not on this floor, whichever one it was. He shrugged, then crawled upwards, sticky fingers sliding effortlessly along the glass. Reaching the edge of the extended balcony, he rounded the railing and leapt on top. A circular pad for helicopters and quinjets to land on sat in the middle of the space, and a small path leading to the entrance was tiled beneath his feet. Just knowing that all of the Avengers had stood in the same place he was standing at some point, from Cap to Bruce Banner to even Thor, made him absolutely giddy. He wondered if he would ever get to meet all of them at the same time someday. You know, when they weren't hellbent on beating the shit out of each other. The possibility seemed pretty slim after everything that had happened between them. Still, he should invest in a selfie stick, just in case. His excitement quickly began to dissipate as he approached the shiny walls, replaced instead by tingly nervousness. What if Sam was the one who had been lying? As much as the idea hurt him, he couldn't dismiss it out of hand. What if he had sugar-coated his side of the story to make Spider-Man sympathize with him and let him go, and Peter had bought it? Then again, Mr. Stark could have done the same thing. That was what he had to find out. Somebody wasn't being straight with him. Somebody was not telling the full truth, and he needed to know who. He had to keep Aunt May safe. Sucking in a deep breath, he gave the glass door a careful push, and it slowly swung open. The room was quiet and empty. A few bottles of expensive-looking spirits were scattered across the counter of the bar to his left, which were the only things suggesting that anyone might actually be living here. Peter stepped inside hesitantly, feeling like an unwelcome intruder against the luxurious space, which he very well might have been. "Mr. Stark?" he called out, gazing around anxiously. The marble floor was frigid beneath his feet. He began to think the place was deserted, until his sensitive ears caught wind of distant, muffled music playing. He followed the noise down 2 flights of stairs until he was face to face with a steel door, which was propped open by an old, rusty Iron Man helmet. Peter slipped through the crack and crept into the impressive workspace. Wrenches and scrap metal and toolboxes were sprawled across the long rows of tables, along with detailed sketches of multiple different suit designs. Some were of costumes for the rest of the Avengers, even those who were currently on the run. Peter walked down the center aisle slowly, marveling at the amazing tech and dying to know how all of it worked, curious eyes darting back and forth. His feet dragged to a stop in front of it. It was outfitted with hundreds of intricate panels and buttons, and had an icy blue circle in the center of the palm. It looked cool as hell. He crouched down to get a closer look, tilting his head to the side and reaching out with tentative fingers to pick it up. "Don't touch that." Spider-Man practically leapt out of his skin. He whipped around and discovered the disheveled billionaire sitting on a stool on the opposite side of the room, a blowtorch in his hand and a welding mask over his face. He was speckled with splotches of oil and grease, and his hair was a wild swirl of messy wisps. A pair of headphones were curled around his neck, quietly howling with some kind of ungodly rock music. He popped the blowtorch in the air a few times. New repulsor gauntlet prototype, highly unstable. Recovering somewhat, Peter relaxed his shoulders and gave a nervous laugh. "Oh, right. Sorry, my bad. I was just looking." Sure." Clearing his throat, Spider-Man effortlessly cleared 2 tables with one leap and landed at Tony Stark's side, crossing his arms close to his chest. "So, what are you working on?" "Nah, Stark snapped. He lifted the welding mask off his face and bopped Peter on the nose, making him flinch and blink. "You gotta answer my questions before you get to ask any. Here I am, sitting in my tower, smack dab in the middle of a very important project, eating a freshly made tuna salad sandwich. And in waltzes a teenager spider brat without any warning whatsoever." He snatched said tuna salad sandwich off a plate and took a big bite, scoffing through his mouthful. "Come on, kid. Don't you know better than to come sneaking into somebody else's place and start messing with their stuff?" Peter shrunk with embarrassment. "Oh, no, I didn't mean to." Giving up, he hung his head. "I'm sorry, we'll leave now." He turned back to the door, shoulders slouched, but Tony caught him by the arm. Hey, he huffed. Peter glanced up at him, and Stark sighed with a small smile. "It's all right. You can stay. Just, what are you even doing here? And how the hell did you get in?" Spider-Man shrugged sheepishly. "The balcony landing pad thing. The door was open." Tony scoffed. "Seriously? Well, that's embarrassing." He lifted his gaze to the ceiling. "Friday. Lock that for me, would ya? And keep it locked." "Already done, boss," a woman's voice replied. Tony stood and laid the blowtorch on the table beside them. "Geez. You sure know how to get under a guy's skin, kid." Peter smiled and scratched the back of his neck. "Funny, my aunt said something along those lines just the other day. So did a burglar I nabbed. And that lady on the subway. And a kid I babysat last Thursday. I'd prefer if you called before just popping by out of the blue. Why are you here? Please tell me you aren't scavenging for food or something. Rhodey's still pissed at me for letting you eat all his protein bars." He dropped the welding mask into a bucket on the floor and scooped up a pile of thin papers. "Or were you hoping to catch a peek of some of the new upgrades I've come up with for your over-glorified leotard?" Spider-Man rubbed his hands together anxiously. He was still so afraid to talk to him about this. But why? He knew Mr. Stark cared about him. At least a little bit. Enough to make him cool suits and act pissed when he got himself injured. But he didn't know if he cared enough to dismiss his loyalty to the accords he had signed. He didn't know if he cared enough to understand what Peter really cared about, and that terrified him. Well, actually. Because if that's the case, I suppose I could show you what I've got. Hiding a suave grin, he turned and marched across the room to a low, wide desk. Peter frowned and followed him to the display. He watched as Tony's hands zipped fluidly across an array of holographic buttons and keyboards. From a virtual stack, he selected a folder labeled Underoos, and flicked through the surprisingly extensive number of files inside. "Okay, well, before that, could I talk to you for just, 1 second about? I've had this idea in mind for a while now, but I wanted to get your opinion on it before finishing the prototype," he said, cutting him off again. "Here we go." Tony tapped on the project document with his index finger. Peter was beginning to grow annoyed. "Mr. Stark, I'm trying to," he started to say, but his words stopped short as an image appeared and expanded before them, making Peter flinch back in surprise. It was a massive, three-dimensional render of the original Spider-Man costume Mr. Stark had made for him, except this one had something a little extra. Under both of the suit's arms, stretching from the elbows to the upper part of each leg, were a pair of wings. Well, not quite wings, more like two thin flaps of wide, taut fabric clearly meant less for actual flight and more for gliding. Regardless, they looked freaking awesome. Even better, the wing things were translucent and decorated with subtle webbing details to match his spidery theme. Altogether, the suit was amazing. Leave it to Tony Stark to somehow find a way to make armpit web wings look cool. Under his mask, Peter couldn't stop himself from gawking. Whoa, is that? Yeah, a flight suit. Glide suit. Something like that. He enlarged the picture and gave it a spin so Spider-Man could see the costume from every angle. I based the design off those fancy wingsuits people use nowadays to fly through canyons and mountains and such with cameras mounted on their heads. Peter laughed disbelieving, the blue light reflecting in his large, white eye lenses. Hey. Or like those flying squirrel things on planet Earth. This is insane, Mr. Stark. How far do you think they would carry me? If I started at, like, the top of the Empire State Building or something, do you think I could make it across the whole city? Oh, now I'm dying to try this. You'd make it for me? Technically, I already have. I just need to assemble all the parts together. I wanted to see if you had any input to give before I went ahead with my design. I had in mind that you could use them in case you ran out of webbing and needed to save yourself from falling to your death, but sure, throw yourself off the tallest building in NYC and see how that works for ya. He placed his hands on his hips. If you're good with my model, I can have the full suit ready for you to test by tomorrow. Peter Parker was beaming. Holy shit. Mr. Stark and I could go flying across the city together. I can't even imagine how amazing that would be. Web wings. Why hadn't he thought of that? Spider-Man gazed up at the 3D projection, just about to voice his excitement and endorsement, then faltered, his smile diminishing. Wait. Whoa. Slow down, Pete. Remember what you came here for. What you came here to do. The airport fight. The Sokovia Accords. Talk first. Then, if everything turns out okay, spider sugar gliding later. Taking a step back, Peter lowered his eyes to the floor, rubbing at his arm. Actually, hold on. Rain check. He paused for a moment, weighing how to word this properly, his nerves returning. Tony narrowed his eyes as Spider-Man inhaled a slow breath. Then he lifted his gaze. The costume, it's really cool, Mr. Stark, and I really appreciate you taking the time to make it for me. For everything you've done for me. You've helped me more than I could ever ask for or deserve. He swallowed. But, I think I need to ask you about a few things before I can let you help me anymore. He waited fearfully while the Avengers stared at him in silent confusion. Tony's frown soon melted into a puzzled smile. Well, that came out of nowhere. Why so serious all of a sudden? Was it something I said? He walked up to him and pulled the Spider-Man mask off his face, revealing the innocent eyes and nervous expression underneath. Oh God, how old are you again? Don't tell me your aunt hasn't given you the talk yet. 'Cause I am not in the mood to delve into details while I've still got half a sandwich left. Peter tried to laugh, but it came out more like an awkward cough. And no, not that. I'm good on that end. I think. He slipped the bunched-up mask off his head and scratched at his messy hair. This has to do with something else. Tony took a second to look over the kid's uncharacteristically troubled appearance, the way you wouldn't meet his gaze, and the comical grin gradually fell from his lips. His eyes clouded with sudden worry, and he leaned down a little so they were at the same level, gripping the young superhero's shoulder in his hand. What? Did something happen? What's the matter? Spill, kid. Spider-Man bit his cheek anxiously. It's just, he began, balling up the mask in his hands. Well, he shook his head and stared up at him. Mr. Stark, am I an Avenger? Peter watched Tony's frown slowly transform into a confused chuckle. What? That's what you... His shoulders relaxed and his grip slackened. Well, hey, that's gonna be a solid no, Champ. Sorry, not even close. Mr. Stark patted him on the arm and turned around, clearly thinking that the matter was settled, but Peter clenched his jaw. So that means the Sokovia Accords don't apply to me, right? Even though he was facing away from him, Peter could see Mr. Stark stiffen slightly at his words, and he knew his smile had vanished. Tony glanced back at him, his brow furrowed. The Accords? Yes. You know, the documents outlining how the Avengers have to be controlled by the government from now on. The papers that Cap's team fought against and your team fought for. The thing that you and Rhodey and everyone else on your side knew about and agreed with and signed. Except for me. He could feel the frustration pushing at the back of his throat with every word, but he fought to keep his voice level. Tony turned all the way towards him. His expression was unreadable. Okay. Yeah. They don't apply to you. He picked up the rest of his sandwich and shoved it into his mouth. So I don't have to worry about any government agents busting down my door and demanding that I work for them anytime soon. Why are you bringing this up all of a sudden? Stark countered crossly. Peter swallowed. Maybe because you didn't bring the Accords up with me before taking me to fight for them, something that I didn't understand at the time and definitely don't agree with. Tony realized that Peter was seriously angry about this, although he didn't really know why. What about them do you not agree with? That they go against everything I do as Spider-Man. They prevent superheroes from protecting the world. They don't let the Avengers help people. Peter, Tony sighed despondently. Listen. You've got to see the big picture here. I know you're young, but you're part of this now, and you can't romanticize superheroes anymore. He grimaced a little as he spoke. The Avengers aren't the flawless saviors you think they are. You don't know how much suffering and death our actions have resulted in, even those with good intentions. You haven't been alive long enough to make the kinds of mistakes that we've made. You haven't had to face situations or make decisions that have cost thousands of innocent people their lives. His eyes were cold and pained. We need a way to keep ourselves grounded. We need to have some type of regulation overseeing this to limit the amount of global devastation we cause. The Accords aren't perfect, but they're the best we're gonna get to meet that need. Now Peter was beginning to finally see it. The two sides of this argument for what they really were. Both were choosing to sacrifice something in order to do what they believed was best for the world based off their personal experiences with failure and heroism. While Cap and his crew gave up their image and allegiance to the justice system to continue protecting the world from evil, Tony and his side chose to surrender their freedom to a higher authority to protect the world from themselves. Both positions had their virtues, and both had their faults. Unfortunately, Peter Parker's exposure to the deadly correlation between danger and inaction forced him to align with the belief that ran opposite to Tony Stark's. And he couldn't keep that to himself any longer. The Avengers don't cause devastation, Mr. Stark, Spider-Man said. They work to stop it. If somebody is trying to stop something terrible from happening, of course they might make mistakes. But that should never stop them from trying to help in the first place, or convince them to let the government prevent them from helping. It isn't that black and white, kid. You have to understand that our call isn't always the right call. Neither is the government's, they're not the enemy here. And neither are we. He almost yelled, then retreated slightly. I mean, why you guys? The Avengers. The Avengers aren't the enemy. The enemy is all the jerks out there who are actually trying to hurt people. Sam told me how he's only breaking the law because he wants to continue protecting the world without dealing with a middleman, even when those special ops dicks keep attacking him and his. Sam? Tony broke in, stepping towards him. You mean Sam Wilson? You talked to him? Peter felt his face go red. Oops. No well. I might have had a tiny, little, chit-chat thing with him. He lowered his gaze. So what? Tony grabbed him by the shoulders. When? Did he attack you? Are you alright? Spider-Man shook his head. And no, of course not. I just ran into him by accident. He was shot down by someone. He was hurt and needed help, so I helped him. And we ended up just kinda talking about everything that's happened. He told me his side of the story. Tony's hand slid down his arms exasperatedly. So that's what this is all about. You need to stay away from him, Peter. All of them. They're dangerous. At least he was honest with me about all of this, he shot back. He explained everything to me that you didn't. He seemed really cool and like he really wanted to help people. He pulled away from his grip. And you know who's more dangerous than him? The bad guys that you're trying to make it impossible for the Avengers to stop. Not impossible, kid, of course not. I want the Avengers to work alongside the UN so we can stop our common enemies together. So we can pick our targets carefully and purposefully instead of barging into other countries and invoking our own personal agenda in places that may not even want our help. It's selfish and ignorant of us to think that our will is the only will that matters when dealing with international threats, and that's what the Accords are meant to fix. Peter stared up at the hardened Avenger in silence, his skin hot from the intensity of the conversation, his mind reeling as he tried to gather his thoughts. He wanted to agree with him. He wanted to see the world the way Tony Stark saw it, when he had watched the weapons he'd created to protect people be used by murderers to kill them instead. When mistakes he had made years and years ago had turned good people bad and resurfaced with a vengeance to destroy hundreds of innocent lives. When something he had designed to bring peace and protection to the earth had turned against him and demolished an entire country, and nearly the entire world. Of course he wanted regulation. How could he trust himself to help the world, after all the blood and suffering his attempts to help it had reaped? He wanted someone to tell him no instead of depending on his own shattered judgment in the face of dire threats. Peter understood why Mr. Stark's guilt was driving him to support his side of the equation. But that didn't mean Spider-Man agreed with him. He dropped his gaze to the floor, fists balled at his sides. Well, you could have at least given me the chance to decide for myself. I don't agree with the Accords, but you made me fight for them. He couldn't keep how hurt he was feeling from bleeding into his voice. Did you? And did you keep me in the dark just so you could use me to defeat Capside? Peter, no, it wasn't like that. He stepped towards him hesitantly. There wasn't enough time to explain, and by that point, it wasn't about the Accords anymore. Barnes, Cap's war friend, the man with the metal arm, he was dangerous. He had broken out of prison, attacked people, and at the time it was my understanding that he was responsible for the explosion in Vienna. He's an assassin for Hydra. He retreated, his voice suddenly uneven. I mean, W was. Regardless, he had killed people, and he needed to be stopped. We were outmanned, and if I didn't catch all of Cap's team or convince them to yield within 36 hours, Ross would have sent his own people to kill them. So I recruited you and anyone else I could to help me stop them so Barnes would be in custody and my friends wouldn't be dead. I knew you and your abilities would help me do that. That's why I wanted you there. His hand prodded unconsciously at his chest, as if he was experiencing some kind of phantom pain. I guess in a way, you're right. I did use you to try to stop Cap. I didn't tell you everything that was going on, and that was wrong of me. I'm sorry for that. I regret bringing you there and getting you involved in our shit show. But I was desperate, and I was doing what I knew had to be done. It's over now. Closing his eyes, Tony Stark leaned back against the stool, his body hunched and weary. As Peter glared at him from a distance, he couldn't decide how he felt about his explanation. It was clear he had come to him for help in a time of weakness, even if Peter hadn't known the full extent of it. He didn't mean it as anything personal. He just wanted to protect his friends. Peter could understood that, although it still made him feel a bit used. But if it was Ross and his goons who had threatened to kill the Avengers if Mr. Stark didn't stop them first, then why did he want the same twisted government panel controlling them? It seemed counterintuitive, especially now that he knew what the people on Captain America's side were still dealing with, and what he could face in the future. But it's not over, Mr. Stark, he said. Not for me. I'm involved now. What if they want me to sign? What if I'm the next hero they want control over? What if they figure out who I am just like you did? His voice was growing chopped and panicky. What if they order you to tell them my identity? Would you? Would you tell them? What if they told the whole world about me? My friends? My aunt? Someone could come after them to get at me, or worse. Peter, Tony interrupted him sharply. He wrapped an arm around his shoulders and made him sit down beside him, yet his movements were slow and gentle. Spider-Man stared up at him, his breathing still a bit shaky. Mr. Stark's hand rested on his back. I want you to listen to me very carefully, alright? Nothing about these Accords or the UN or SHIELD or any other stupid security agency will ever convince me to do anything that might hurt you. I'll screw them all to hell 1,000 times over and have my ass thrown in prison before I let that happen. No matter what comes out of this, I won't let them lay a finger on you or anyone you care about. His eyes were startlingly intense as he spoke, yet at the same time soft. You disagreeing with me or not about all this political crap doesn't change anything. Your secret is safe with me, and so are your loved ones. I promise you, okay? The teen held Mr. Stark's earnest gaze for a long moment. His hands were restless in his lap, and his skin felt itchy beneath his tight-fit costume. Tony waited to hear his response, growing more and more anxious as the silence stretched into nearly a minute. Then, without a word, Peter stood and walked back to the table, picking up his Spider-Man mask and carefully slipping it back over his head. Stark rose to his feet as the kid strode towards the door. Peter? What's the matter? Where are you going? And nothing. Nowhere. It's just… He slung his backpack onto his shoulder, looking uneasy and distant, like all the answers he had received throughout their conversation had only bred more questions in his troubled mind. His fingers kneaded at the doorknob. I just need to think about some things. Thanks for talking with me, Mr. Stark. Even though I kinda broke in here without permission. Then he stepped through the doorway and out of the room. Baffled, Tony trailed behind him, following him up the stairs, wondering what the hell the kid was trying to say. He ascended to the highest floor of the tower. Peter, he called, wanting to let him know that from now on he could stop by any time he liked. He didn't want him to feel like he was unwelcome if he planned on returning without a heads up in the future. But by the time he reached the upper room, Spider-Man was already leaping off the balcony and swinging across the city, disappearing behind a wall of gray buildings within seconds. Tony Stark leaned off the railing as he watched him vanish, a slow and heavy sigh sliding from his lips. Friday, he hollered towards the ceiling, his gaze still locked on the urban skyline. Yes, boss, the woman's voice replied. Tony turned to face the curving staircase and began making his way back to his workspace, rubbing his eyes with the heel of his hand. Unlock that door for me, will ya? And keep it unlocked.